Before we descend into the mountains tonight, if you're enjoying this documentary, hit that hype button. It truly helps this channel grow in ways you might not realise. The algorithm favours engagement, and your support means everything. Also, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing our community span across time zones and continents. No pressure though, only if you feel like sharing. Now let's talk about what happens when a skeptic goes looking for truth in America's oldest mountains and finds something that was never meant to be found. Introduction: The Man Who Went Looking. Jacob Merrin made his living dismantling myths. For 6 years he had travelled from alleged haunted asylums to supposed UFO hotspots, camera in hand, debunking every paranormal claim that crossed his desk. His documentary photography series, Folklore Exposed, had gained a substantial following among rationalists and skeptics alike. He was methodical, scientific, and utterly convinced that every unexplained phenomenon had a logical explanation waiting to be uncovered. In September of 2021, Jacob announced his most ambitious project yet. He would traverse the Appalachian mountain corridor, that ancient spine of stone running from Virginia down into North Carolina, and systematically debunk a collection of conspiracy theories that had been festering in online forums for decades. His target list was extensive and bizarre. Off-limits communities hidden in forgotten hollows, clusters of vanishing people that defied statistical probability, the so-called not deer sightings that plagued hikers' testimonies, mysterious staircases found deep in the woods leading nowhere, the epidemic of disappearances near the Smoky Mountain region, and perhaps most intriguingly, rumours of federal black sites concealed within the endless forest. Jacob posted his intentions across every platform he could access. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Thousands of comments flooded in, some encouraging, many warning, a few outright threatening. But it was a direct message that arrived 3 days after his announcement that gave him pause, however briefly. The sender's profile was blank, scrubbed of identifying information. The message itself was chillingly simple. If you're going up there, avoid the corridor between Roan Mountain and Klingman's Dome. That's where they watch. Jacob screenshot the message, added it to his growing file of fear-mongering nonsense, and continued his preparations. He had received hundreds of similar warnings over the years. They all followed the same pattern: vague threats, ominous warnings, never any concrete evidence. He had learned to ignore them. That decision, that single choice to dismiss the anonymous warning, would alter the trajectory of his life in ways he could never have anticipated. Part 1. The Documented Reality. Jacob began his investigation the way he always did, by separating verifiable fact from embellished fiction. Before he could debunk the conspiracy theories, he needed to understand what was actually true about the Appalachian wilderness. The research phase revealed several undeniable realities that even the most skeptical observer couldn't dismiss. The Appalachian Range, despite being one of the most visited mountain systems in America, contained vast expanses that remained genuinely remote. While not officially designated as restricted or forbidden zones, certain areas possessed characteristics that made them effectively inaccessible to casual hikers and even experienced outdoorsmen. Cell phone signals vanished completely in numerous valleys and hollows. Jacob documented over 40 separate regions where communication technology simply ceased to function, creating blind spots in our otherwise connected world. Large tracts of land, some spanning several square miles, rarely if ever saw patrol by park rangers due to difficult terrain and limited resources. The official explanation cited budget constraints and prioritization of high-traffic areas, but the result was the same: regions of American wilderness that existed in a state of near-complete isolation. The cave systems presented another verified mystery. Geological surveys from the 1950s through the 1970s had documented extensive subterranean networks throughout the Appalachians, but many of these systems remained unmapped. The reasons given varied: unstable rock formations, dangerous underground rivers, the sheer complexity and scope of the tunnel networks. Whatever the cause, large portions of what existed beneath the mountains remained officially unknown. Then there were the sealed mining operations. Throughout the mid-20th century, particularly between the 1950s and 1970s, the federal government had closed numerous mining tunnels across the Appalachian range. The official record cited structural instability and environmental concerns. Heavy metal gates were installed, warning plaques mounted, and the sites were effectively abandoned. Jacob found documentation for dozens of these closures, but what struck him was the pattern. Many had been sealed suddenly, without the gradual wind-down typical of depleted mining operations. The missing persons statistics presented the most troubling verified data. Local search and rescue organisations maintained records of disappearances that revealed genuine clusters, concentrations of missing persons cases that exceeded normal statistical distribution. The National Park Service acknowledged these patterns, but attributed them to the inherent dangers of wilderness recreation. People got lost, fell from cliffs, succumbed to exposure. The mountains were unforgiving to the unprepared. Jacob compiled all of this verified information into a comprehensive report. These were the facts, the documented realities that conspiracy theorists used as the foundation for their more outlandish claims. He filmed himself presenting this data, his voice steady and professorial, explaining that while these elements were unusual, they didn't require supernatural or governmental conspiracy explanations. Remote wilderness areas naturally led to communication dead zones. Budget limitations naturally led to unpatrolled regions. Complex cave systems naturally remained unmapped due to danger and difficulty. Mining operations naturally closed due to economic and safety factors, and people naturally went missing in vast, dangerous wilderness. It was all perfectly logical, perfectly explainable, perfectly rational. He had no way of knowing how quickly that certainty would erode. Part 2. The Indigenous Perspective. Before entering the mountains, Jacob made a point of consulting with those who had known the land longest. He had learned from previous investigations that indigenous perspectives, while often dismissed by mainstream sources, frequently contained valuable historical context that could explain the origins of various myths and legends. He arranged a meeting with Thomas Whitehawk, a Cherokee historian and cultural preservation specialist based in Cherokee, North Carolina. The interview took place in a small office, cluttered with books, maps, and artifacts. Thomas was a man in his 60s, soft-spoken but with eyes that suggested he had seen more than he typically discussed. Jacob explained his project, his intention to explore the conspiracy theories surrounding the Appalachian corridor and provide rational explanations for the various claims. Thomas listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. When Jacob finished, Thomas was quiet for a long moment before responding. "The Cherokee have stories about these mountains that go back longer than your written history," Thomas began. "There are regions our ancestors avoided, not because of superstition, but because of experience passed down through generations." Jacob leaned forward with his recorder, eager to document what he assumed would be useful folklore. Thomas continued. "We spoke of forest mimics, things that could copy sounds, voices, the appearance of animals or even people. We warned of false animals, creatures that looked right from a distance but wrong up close. There were voices that called from behind trees, trying to lure people away from safe paths, and there was the land between the mountains, a place where the barriers between worlds grew thin." "These are metaphors though, right?" Jacob interjected. "Ways of explaining natural phenomena that your ancestors didn't have scientific language to describe." Thomas gave him a look that wasn't quite pity, but close. "You're not the first to come here with cameras and skepticism. Others have made the same journey you're planning. And some came back different. Some didn't come back at all. And some came back but wished they hadn't." Jacob smiled, thinking he was being tested. "I appreciate the warning, but I'm going in with an open mind and scientific methodology. If there's something genuinely unexplained up there, I'll document it. But I've been doing this for 6 years, and I've never encountered anything that couldn't be explained by psychology, environmental factors, or simple misidentification. Thomas stood, signalling the interview was ending. As Jacob packed his equipment, the historian said something that would echo in his mind during the weeks to come. "You're not going up there for proof, Mr. Merrin. You're going up there to be noticed." Jacob laughed it off, thanked Thomas for his time, and left to begin his expedition. He had the rational explanations he needed for the Cherokee warnings: cultural trauma from colonization, natural human tendency to mythologize the unknown, the psychological need to explain tragedy, and loss through narrative. It all made sense. But Thomas's final words lingered inexplicably in the back of his mind. Part 3. The Ranger Logs. The breakthrough came 3 weeks into Jacob's research phase, before he had even entered the deep mountain regions. He had filed a Freedom of Information Act request for ranger logs and incident reports from the Great Smoky Mountains National Park and surrounding protected areas, focusing on the corridor between Roan Mountain and Klingman's Dome, the exact region his anonymous messenger had warned him to avoid. The documents arrived heavily redacted. Large sections were blacked out, marked with exemption codes citing ongoing investigations or privacy concerns. But what remained was fascinating enough. Jacob spread the papers across his hotel room desk, organising them chronologically. The entries spanned from the 1990s to the present day, and certain patterns emerged that troubled him despite his scepticism. An entry from July of 1998. Unidentified screaming reported near Alum Cave Trail. Multiple witnesses. Search conducted. No source found. No missing persons reported. Sounds did not match any known wildlife. From October 2003. Large animal reported by day hikers on Appalachian Trail section near Roan High Knob. Description doesn't match bear, elk, or any catalogued species. Track search conducted. No tracks found despite muddy terrain. April 2007. Patrol unit missing for 9 hours during routine sweep of Cataloochee area. Rangers eventually located at trailhead, confused and unable to explain timeline gap. Both showed signs of mild dehydration, but insisted they had only been gone for approximately 2 hours. GPS tracking confirms 9-hour absence. Medical evaluation inconclusive. The entries grew stranger. August 2011. Unauthorized campfire observed from ridge overlook after dark. Dispatch sent to investigate and issue citation. Upon arrival at location, no fire found, no evidence of recent fire, ground cold, no tracks or disturbed vegetation. December 2013. Solo hiker reported seeing people standing in trees approximately half a mile off trail near Klingman's Dome Access Road. Search conducted, no evidence of climbers or equipment. Hiker assessed for possible hypothermia or confusion. Physical health normal. But it was the final entry in the batch, dated March of 2015, that made Jacob pause. Unlike the clinical bureaucratic tone of the previous reports, this one read like a warning. To all patrol units, if approached by persons calling for help from off-trail locations, do not follow voices without visual confirmation of distressed individual. Do not engage in extended eye contact with any persons exhibiting unusual behaviour or physical characteristics. Report anything that appears human but produces uncanny valley response. Do not investigate alone. Maintain radio contact at all times. Jacob read it 3 times. The language was oddly specific. Uncanny valley response. That psychological term for the unsettling feeling produced by something almost human, but not quite right. Why would a park ranger report include such phrasing? He called the Park Service Administration Office, asking about the origin of this particular protocol. After being transferred several times, he was eventually told that the document must be a prank or training exercise that had been accidentally filed with genuine reports. There was no such official protocol. but the document had an official header, an official file number, and sat among verified reports. Jacob added it to his unexplained folder, which was growing thicker than he found comfortable. Still, he reasoned, bureaucracies made mistakes. Rangers had senses of humour. There were rational explanations. He had to believe that. Part 4. Into the mountains. Jacob entered the mountain corridor in the first week of October. The timing was deliberate. Past peak tourist season, but before winter weather made the high elevations dangerous. He would be alone, which was how he preferred to work. No crew to influence his observations, no other voices in his recordings. Just him, his cameras, and the wilderness. The first 3 days were uneventful, almost disappointingly so. He hiked well-travelled trails, documented beautiful autumn scenery, and encountered nothing more unusual than a black bear rummaging through a poorly secured trash bin. He recorded several conversational pieces to camera, explaining how conspiracy theories often arose from pattern-seeking behaviour and confirmation bias. He was in his element, confident and articulate. On the 4th day, he veered off the marked trails. He had studied topographical maps for weeks, identifying areas rarely visited by casual hikers. His target was a region northeast of Roan Mountain, in a valley that sat in a documented cell signal dead zone. If strange things were happening in the Appalachians, he reasoned they would be happening in places like this, isolated, unmonitored, genuinely remote. The descent into the valley took most of the morning. The forest was dense, the understory thick with rhododendron that forced him to move slowly. By noon, his phone had lost all signal, exactly as predicted. He was truly alone now, miles from the nearest trail, in terrain that probably saw fewer than a dozen visitors per year. That's when he saw the deer. It stood in a small clearing about 50 feet ahead, perfectly still. Too still. Deer were nervous creatures, constantly alert, ears twitching, tails flicking. This one could have been a statue. Jacob raised his camera, thinking he might capture some nice wildlife footage. Through the viewfinder he could see the animal more clearly. It was large, male, with a full rack of antlers. Its coat was the right colour, its proportions seemingly correct. Then it turned its head to look at him. The movement was wrong. The rotation was too smooth, too far, the neck bending at an angle that shouldn't have been anatomically possible. The head swiveled nearly 180 degrees while the body remained stationary, bringing the deer's face into full view. The eyes reflected white, like a nightshine effect, except it was the middle of the day. Jacob's finger froze on the camera's record button. Through the viewfinder, he watched as the creature took a step toward him. Not the bounding, nervous movement of a deer, but a deliberate forward step, like a human walking. Another step. Smooth, purposeful. The camera was recording. Jacob's rational mind screamed at him that this was just a deer, that he was seeing things, that the angle was creating an optical illusion. But some deeper, older part of his brain was screaming something else entirely. Run. The creature took a 3rd step. Its mouth opened slightly, and Jacob could see that the teeth were wrong. Too many of them. Too sharp. He lowered the camera from his eye, and the moment he did, the thing in the clearing bolted, but not like a deer. It moved in a sideways scuttle that reminded him of a crab, impossibly fast, vanishing into the forest in seconds. Jacob stood in the sudden silence, his heart hammering, his hands shaking. He looked down at his camera, praying the footage had captured what he'd just seen. He hit playback. The footage was there. The clearing. The creature that looked like a deer but moved wrong. But the image was corrupted, glitching every few seconds. Horizontal lines of static cutting across the screen. The audio was worse. A rhythmic clicking sound that definitely hadn't been present during the actual encounter. Jacob played it again and again. The rational explanations lined up in his mind like soldiers. Equipment malfunction. Stress-induced hallucination. Unusual deer behaviour misinterpreted through adrenaline and expectation. But he had seen what he had seen. For the first time in 6 years of investigation, Jacob Merrin felt the cold touch of genuine uncertainty. Part 5. The locals speak. Jacob emerged from the mountains 2 days later, hiking back to civilization with his corrupted footage and shaken confidence. He needed to talk to people who actually lived in these regions, who dealt with the mountains daily rather than as occasional visitors. He found them in a small town outside Banner Elk, North Carolina, one of those places that existed more as a wide spot in the road than an actual municipality. A gas station, a general store, a post office, and a diner that probably hadn't updated its menu since the 1980s. Jacob started conversations carefully. He had learned that locals in isolated communities were often suspicious of outsiders, especially outsiders with cameras asking about strange occurrences. He presented himself as a nature photographer, interested in the history and folklore of the area. At first, no one would speak to him. Polite but distant, they answered his questions with non-committal grunts and changed the subject. It wasn't until his 3rd day in town, after he had become a familiar face at the diner, that someone finally opened up. His name was Earl Hutchins, a man in his 70s who had lived in these mountains his entire life. He worked as a hunting guide in his younger years, and now spent his retirement fixing small engines in a shed behind his house. They were sitting on Earl's porch, watching the sun set behind the ridgeline, when Jacob finally asked directly, "Have you ever seen anything up there that you couldn't explain?" Earl was quiet for a long time, so long that Jacob thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, without looking at Jacob, Earl spoke. "You shouldn't be up here alone. They take the ones who come looking." Jacob's recorder was running in his pocket. He kept his voice neutral. "Who are they?" Earl pointed at the tree line, dark now in the fading light. "The ones who live underneath." "Underneath what?" "The mountains. In the old mines, the caves, the tunnels that go deeper than any map shows." Earl finally looked at Jacob, his eyes serious. Government sealed most of them back in '68 after the collapses, but the collapses weren't accidents. Things were happening down there. Men going missing, equipment failing, sounds in the dark that shouldn't have been possible. "What kind of sounds?" "Voices, but not human voices. Things that could copy what we said, play it back at us. Things that could sound like your friend, your wife, your child, calling for help from deeper in the tunnel. Smart men, experienced miners, they'd follow those voices right into the dark. Most of them never came back out." Jacob felt a chill despite the warm evening. "And the ones who did?" "They didn't talk much about it. Couldn't, really. Their minds were broken. They'd seen something down there that human minds weren't meant to process." Earl stood, signalling the conversation was over. As Jacob gathered his things to leave, Earl added one more thing. "There's a woman in town, Arden Pike. Her husband worked on the geological surveys in the 70s, before they sealed everything up. She might talk to you, might not, but she's got maps." Part 6. The map. Arden Pike lived in a small house at the edge of town, its garden overgrown with herbs and wildflowers. She was in her late 80s, thin and sharp-eyed, with hands that trembled slightly as she poured tea into chipped mugs. Jacob had called ahead, explaining that Earl had sent him. That earned him an invitation, but not necessarily trust. "My husband Samuel worked for the Geological Survey," Arden said, settling into a chair by the window. "Back when the government was still interested in mapping what was under these mountains instead of just sealing it away." Earl mentioned he might have made maps of the area, Arden nodded slowly. "He did, and what he found down there haunted him until the day he died." She stood, moving to an old desk in the corner. From a locked drawer she produced a rolled piece of paper, yellowed with age. She spread it on the table between them. Jacob leaned forward, his pulse quickening. The map showed the mountain region between Roan Mountain and Clingman's Dome, exactly the corridor he'd been warned to avoid. But this wasn't a typical topographical map. This showed what lay beneath. Tunnels. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, forming a network far more extensive than Jacob had imagined possible. They branched and connected, creating a subterranean maze that spanned miles. In the centre of the map, a region was circled in red ink. The circle encompassed an area of several square miles. Inside the circle, in Samuel's handwriting, were 2 words: the corridor. "What is the corridor?" Jacob asked. Arden's hand shook as she touched the map. Samuel said it was the main arterial. All the smaller tunnels, the natural caves, the mining shafts, they all connected back to this central system, and it went deep, deeper than they had equipment to measure properly. Did he explore it? He tried. The government sent teams down in the early 70s trying to map the extent of the network. Samuel was part of the last survey team before they sealed everything. She paused, her eyes distant. He came home different, shaking, wouldn't eat for days, had nightmares for months. What did he see down there? He wouldn't tell me, not fully, but he said the tunnels weren't empty. There were things living down there, things that had been there long before humans started digging, and they didn't like being disturbed. She pointed to several notations on the map, small X marks scattered throughout the tunnel system. These are where they found evidence of habitation, not human habitation. Whatever lived down there built structures, used tools, had some kind of civilization, but it wasn't like anything recognised by anthropology or archaeology. Jacob's mind raced. This was either an elaborate hoax or evidence of something genuinely extraordinary. Did he take photos? Collect samples? Arden shook her head. Everything was confiscated. Once the government decided to seal the tunnels, all documentation was classified. Samuel was threatened with prosecution if he spoke about what he'd seen. This map, she tapped it gently, he drew from memory after they took the originals. He wanted someone to know the truth. Why show me? Because you're going to go down there anyway. I can see it in your eyes. You've already seen something that shook you, and now you need to know if it's real. She rolled up the map and handed it to him. Take it. Maybe you'll be smart enough to turn back, but I doubt it. People who go looking for the truth in these mountains rarely find what they expect. Jacob left Arden's house as darkness settled over the town. The map felt heavy in his backpack, weighted with more than just paper and ink. He knew what he had to do next. Part 7. The Corridor. Jacob spent the next week preparing. He studied the map obsessively, cross-referencing it with modern topographical surveys and satellite imagery. He located the likely position of the sealed mine entrance that Arden's husband had indicated as the primary access point to the corridor. His rational mind offered countless reasons not to pursue this. The mine would be sealed. It would be dangerous. He had no spelunking experience. He would be trespassing on federal land. But he had also seen the not deer. He had read the ranger logs. He had spoken to people who genuinely believed something lived beneath these mountains. And if there was any truth to it, any truth at all, he needed to document it. He found the mine entrance on the 13th day of October, exactly where Arden's map suggested it would be. A metal gate, industrial and imposing, blocked a tunnel entrance cut into the mountainside. The gate was reinforced with heavy bolts, and a metal plaque warned in bold letters, "Dangerous, area unstable, entry prohibited." Jacob examined the gate closely. Despite the warning suggesting decades of abandonment, the bolts looked relatively new. The metal showed little rust. Someone had maintained this seal recently. He circled the site looking for alternative entry points. The tunnel mouth was large, probably 10 feet high and 12 feet wide, suggesting it had been a significant mining operation. Vegetation had grown up around the entrance, but not as much as he would expect for something sealed since the 1960s. Then he heard it. A sound from inside the tunnel, faint but distinct. Jacob froze, listening. It came again, a rhythmic sound, like metal scraping against stone, or something moving. He pulled out his audio recorder and pressed it against the metal gate. The sound was clearer now, scraping, deliberate, following a pattern. Then it stopped. In the sudden silence, Jacob heard something else, something that made his hands go cold. Footsteps, his footsteps, the exact rhythm and cadence of his walking replayed from inside the tunnel. He jerked back from the gate, his heart racing. Whatever was inside was mimicking him, copying the sounds he made. Jacob should have left. Every instinct screamed at him to get away from this place, to hike back to civilization, to abandon this investigation entirely. Instead, he set up his camera, angled it at the gate, and pressed record. "This is the entrance to what locals call the corridor," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "I'm documenting evidence of what appears to be acoustic anomalies, sounds emanating from inside a tunnel that's been sealed for over 50 years. He paused, listening. The mimicking had stopped. The tunnel was silent again. "I'm going to attempt to get a recording from inside the mine using extended audio equipment." Jacob had come prepared. From his pack he pulled a length of cable and a small waterproof microphone. The gate had a gap near the bottom, where erosion had created a space between metal and stone. The gap was narrow, maybe 3 inches, but wide enough for his microphone. He lowered the device through the gap, playing out 20 feet of cable. The microphone dangled somewhere in the darkness beyond the gate. He activated the recording device and waited. For 5 minutes, nothing but silence. Jacob checked the equipment, confirming it was functioning properly. Then the sounds began. Multiple voices, whispering. Not words exactly, but vocalization that suggested language, communication. The whispers overlapped, creating a dissonant choir. Beneath the voices, that metallic scraping again, rhythmic, purposeful. Then, cutting through the other sounds, something that made Jacob's skin crawl. A child laughing, clear, distinct, human. And finally, the sound of something large moving deeper in the tunnel. Not walking, dragging. The whispers suddenly coalesced into words, or something close to words. The voices said in perfect unison, "Come down!" Jacob yanked the cable, pulling the microphone back through the gap so fast he scraped his knuckles on the metal. He shut off the recording device with shaking hands. His skepticism, his 6 years of debunking, his scientific methodology, all of it crumbled in the face of what he'd just recorded. This wasn't psychological. It wasn't environmental factors. It wasn't misidentification. There was something inside that mountain. Something aware. Something that knew he was there. Something that wanted him to enter. Part 8. The Evidence. Jacob hiked 3 miles before he stopped, his hands still shaking. He found a relatively flat area off the trail, set up his camp and forced himself to review the audio recording. In the fading daylight through his headphones, the sounds were even more disturbing than they'd been in real time. The whispering voices, the scraping, the child's laughter that sounded wrong somehow, too precise, too perfect. And those final words, "Come down." He saved multiple copies of the file, backing it up to his phone, his computer, a cloud server. This was evidence, real evidence, the kind that could change everything. But evidence of what? He still didn't know. The next morning, Jacob made a decision. He would search the area around the mine entrance for any other clues before attempting to contact authorities with his findings. If there was more to document, he needed to find it. He worked methodically, spiraling outward from the sealed tunnel, documenting everything with his camera. Most of what he found was mundane. Typical forest detritus, animal burrows, weathered rock formations. Then, in a small ravine about 1/2 mile from the mine entrance, he found something that shouldn't have been there. A backpack. Old, weathered, the fabric degraded by years of exposure. But not decades. The synthetic material would have lasted longer if it had been there since the 60s. Jacob photographed it in situ before carefully opening it. Inside, a water bottle dated 1993. a mouldy trail map, a wallet with a driver's license. The face on the license was a young woman, smiling, full of life. The name read Jennifer Hastings. Jacob's hands trembled as he took out his phone and searched the name combined with missing person Appalachian. The results came immediately. Jennifer Hastings, age 24, disappeared while hiking the Appalachian Trail in June of 1993. Last seen near the Roan Mountain section. Never found. Case remained open, but cold. He had just found evidence from a 30-year-old missing person case. Jacob continued his search with renewed urgency. 20 feet from the backpack, partially buried in leaf litter, he found a shoe. The style was dated, the material degraded, but still recognizable. He documented it, then searched wider. More items emerged from his search. A camping stove, a flashlight that looked like a design from the 80s, a small camera that predated digital technology. And then he found the photos. They were Polaroids, faded and water damaged, but still visible. The first few showed typical hiking scenes, mountain vistas, trail markers, camp setups. But the last 3 photos made Jacob's stomach turn. They were taken inside a tunnel. The flash had illuminated rough stone walls, and in each photo, standing at the edge of the light, were shapes. Humanoid shapes. Tall and thin, with proportions that weren't quite right. In the final photo, one of the shapes was closer. Much closer. Close enough that features were visible. A face that was almost human but stretched wrong, with eyes too large and too far apart. The mouth open in what could have been a smile or a scream. Jacob sat back on his heels, his mind reeling. These weren't hoax photos. They were decades old, genuine Polaroids, found with the possessions of a confirmed missing person. This was evidence that whatever lived in these tunnels had been taking people for at least 3 decades, probably longer. He was no longer debunking anything. He was documenting something that authorities either didn't know about or had actively covered up. The rational explanations were gone. Jacob Merrin, professional skeptic, had found proof of something he couldn't explain, and he had no idea what to do with it. Part 9. The warning. Jacob was hiking back towards civilization, his backpack heavy with evidence, when he encountered them. 2 men dressed in dark uniforms that lacked any identifying patches or insignia. They stepped onto the trail ahead of him, appearing so suddenly that Jacob stopped in his tracks. "Mr. Merrin," one of them said. Not a question. They knew who he was. "Who are you?" Jacob asked, his hand instinctively moving toward his camera. "That's not relevant," the second man said. "What's relevant is where you've been, and what you've seen." "I'm hiking. I'm a nature photographer. I have permits for—" "Did you enter the restricted sectors?" the first man interrupted. "Did you see anything unusual?" Jacob's mind raced. These weren't park rangers. Their uniforms were wrong, their demeanour wrong. The way they spoke suggested military or intelligence training. "I don't know what you mean by restricted sectors," Jacob said carefully. "I've been on public trails." The second man stepped closer. "Mr. Merrin, we know about your investigation. We know you've been asking questions about the sealed mining operations. We know you found the entrance to the corridor. We're not here to arrest you," the first man said. "We're here to give you information that might keep you alive. If you keep walking into the corridor, you won't walk back out. People have been disappearing in this region for longer than you can imagine. The government knows why, and the government has made the decision that the risk of public knowledge outweighs the risk of continued disappearances." Jacob felt anger rising through his fear. "You're admitting there's a cover-up? That people have been dying and you've done nothing?" "We're admitting nothing," the second man said coldly. "We're offering you advice. Take your footage, take your notes, and leave. Publish nothing. Discuss nothing. Forget everything you think you've learned." "And if I don't?" The 2 men exchanged a glance. The first one spoke, his voice colder now. "Then you join the list of people who went looking for truth in these mountains. There's a reason the missing person rate is so high in this region. Not everyone who disappears does so accidentally." The threat was clear. Jacob's hand tightened on his camera strap. "You're threatening me." "We're warning you," the second man corrected. "There's a difference. We actually would prefer you survive this, but preference doesn't determine outcome." They stepped off the trail, melting back into the forest with disturbing efficiency. Within seconds, they were gone, leaving Jacob alone on the trail with his racing heart and evidence-laden backpack. He stood there for a long moment, processing what had just happened. Then he made a decision. He wasn't leaving. Not yet. If they were this desperate to scare him away, it meant his investigation had gotten close to something they wanted to keep hidden. And Jacob Merrin, for all his skepticism, had always been stubborn. He'd come to debunk conspiracy theories. Instead, he had found evidence of an actual conspiracy. He wasn't going to walk away now. Part 10. Return to the corridor. Jacob waited until evening before returning to the mine entrance. He approached carefully, watching for the uniformed men, but saw no one. The forest was quiet, almost too quiet. The sealed gate was different. When Jacob had left it that morning, the gate had been intact, solidly bolted. Now the metal was bent outward, the bolts sheared off or ripped from their moorings. The gap was wide enough for a person to enter, or for something to exit. Jacob's camera was already recording as he approached. His voice, when he spoke, was barely above a whisper. "The sealed gate has been breached. The damage appears recent. I can't tell if this was done from inside or outside, but the metal has been bent with considerable force." He shone his flashlight through the opening. The tunnel stretched beyond, disappearing into darkness. The air coming from inside was cold and carried a smell, mineral and wrong, like metal and decay. This was insanity. Jacob knew it was insanity. Going into an unstable mine tunnel alone, at night, after being threatened by mysterious government agents. Every rational instinct he possessed screamed at him to leave. But he had spent 6 years debunking myths. He had spent his entire adult life demanding proof, evidence, scientific rigour. Now he was standing at the threshold of something that defied everything he thought he knew about reality. He had to know. Jacob squeezed through the gap in the gate, his backpack scraping against metal. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing a tunnel that stretched far beyond what he'd expected. The walls were partially natural cave formation, partially carved by human hands. Support timbers, old and weathered, still stood at intervals. The floor was uneven, covered in debris and what might have been old mining equipment. He moved carefully, documenting everything with his camera. The tunnel sloped downward, descending deeper into the mountain. After 50 feet, Jacob noticed something that made him pause. The walls weren't just rock and earth. There were carvings. He moved closer, shining his light directly on the stone. The carvings were crude but deliberate. Figures that were roughly humanoid but elongated, stretched impossibly tall and thin. Their heads were smooth and featureless except for large, almond-shaped eyes. These weren't modern carvings. The stone around them showed age, weathering. These markings could have been here for decades, maybe longer. Jacob photographed everything, his hands steadier now that he was focused on documentation. This was evidence. This was proof of something, even if he didn't fully understand what. The tunnel descended further. Jacob marked his path as he went, leaving small reflective strips he could follow back out. He had descended approximately 200 feet when the tunnel opened into a larger chamber. Jacob's flashlight was inadequate for the space. He could see the walls extending beyond his light's reach. The ceiling disappeared into darkness above. And scattered across the chamber floor were bones. Not animal bones, human bones. Jacob felt bile rise in his throat. There were dozens of them, maybe hundreds, arranged in patterns that suggested intentional placement. Circles within circles, lines radiating outward from a central point. This was a burial site, or something worse. He forced himself to document it, his camera recording the horror. He counted skulls, at least 30 visible in his light's range, representing decades of missing persons that had never been found. How many people had died down here? How many had walked into these tunnels and never walked back out? Then he heard it. That low humming he had picked up on his external microphone. But now he was inside, and the sound was everywhere, vibrating through the stone, through his bones. It was almost mechanical, but not quite. Like a machine designed by something that had never heard a machine before. The sound was coming from deeper in the chamber. Jacob moved toward it, his rational mind finally silenced. He was beyond rationality now, beyond skepticism. He was following something fundamental, the human need to know, to understand, even at terrible cost. His light found the source. At the far end of the chamber was a doorway, not carved from stone, not built by miners. It was too smooth, too perfectly geometric. The material reflected his light in a way stone shouldn't, almost metallic, but not quite. And beyond the doorway, a faint light glowed. Not fire, not electric, something else. Jacob approached the threshold. His camera was recording. Whatever happened next would be documented. He heard movement behind him. Jacob spun, his flashlight sweeping across the chamber. For a moment, he saw nothing. Then, at the edge of his light, shapes resolved from the darkness. They were tall, impossibly tall. Their limbs were too long, their joints bending in too many places. They moved with a fluid grace that was utterly unlike human movement. Their heads turned toward him, smooth and pale, with those large, dark eyes that reflected his light like mirrors. One of them moved closer, its head cocked to the side, studying him the way a scientist might study a specimen. Then it opened its mouth, opening far wider than anatomy should allow, and spoke. "Jacob!" It was his voice. Perfect. Exact. His own voice played back at him from something that was definitely not human. Jacob's camera captured everything. His hand, operating on pure instinct, kept the device steady and recording even as his mind struggled to process what he was seeing. There were more of them now. 6, 8, a dozen, emerging from the darkness surrounding him, studying him with those terrible eyes. The first one spoke again, still in Jacob's voice. "Come down!" Then another spoke, and its voice was different, a woman's voice, young, terrified. "Help me!" Jennifer Hastings' voice, perhaps. Copied, preserved, replayed. Another. "Daddy!" A child's voice, broken with tears. They were mimics, all of them. Collecting voices, using them, playing them back in combinations that suggested they were trying to communicate, to understand. Jacob realized with sudden, horrible clarity what he was seeing. These weren't monsters in the traditional sense. They were something else. Something that had existed beneath these mountains for longer than human habitation. Something that had watched humans, studied them, tried to understand them by copying their sounds, their patterns, their behaviours. The sealed tunnels, the government cover-up, the warnings. It all made terrible sense now. There was something living under the Appalachian mountains. Something intelligent. Something that had been here first. "I need to go," Jacob said aloud, his real voice cracking. The creatures didn't move to stop him. They simply watched, their heads tilting in synchronized motion. Jacob backed away, keeping his camera running, his flashlight sweeping across the gathered figures. He reached the tunnel entrance and ran. Behind him, he heard his own voice echoing through the chamber. "I need to go! I need to go! I need to go!" They were learning. Always learning. Part 11. The Chase. Jacob ran through the tunnel, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly. Behind him he heard movement. Rapid, skittering sounds against stone. They were following. He grabbed his reflective markers as he passed, confirming his path back to the entrance. His breath came in ragged gasps. His pack bounced against his back, heavy with evidence, with proof. The tunnel seemed longer now, stretching endlessly. Had he really come this far down? The distance seemed impossible. Behind him, his own voice called out, "Jacob! Jacob! Jacob!" They were getting closer. He rounded a corner and his light caught something that hadn't been there before, a metallic structure too smooth and perfect to be natural. It extended from floor to ceiling, blocking most of the tunnel. There was a gap, barely wide enough to squeeze through. Jacob didn't hesitate. He pushed through, his pack catching on the metal. For a horrible moment he was stuck, trapped between the structure and the stone wall. Then something gave, his pack ripped, and he tumbled through, to the other side. He scrambled to his feet and ran. The entrance was ahead. He could see the night sky through the gap in the gate. Blessed darkness that meant freedom. Jacob burst through the opening, falling onto the rocky ground outside. He rolled, coming up in a crouch, his light pointed back at the tunnel. The creatures had stopped at the threshold. They stood just inside the entrance, a wall of pale forms with two long limbs and tilted heads. They didn't exit, couldn't exit, wouldn't exit. Jacob didn't wait to find out. He grabbed his torn pack and ran into the forest, navigating by moonlight and memory, not stopping until he reached his vehicle 2 miles away. He threw everything into his car and drove, away from the mountains, away from the corridor, away from the things that watched from beneath. It was only when he was 50 miles away, on a major highway with streetlights and traffic, that he allowed himself to stop and check his equipment. The camera was still recording. The memory card was intact. Jacob had evidence, actual documented evidence of something that should not exist. He had proof. Epilogue. The aftermath. Jacob Merrin never published his footage. 3 days after his escape from the tunnel, he was contacted by federal agents, proper agents this time, with badges and documentation. They were polite but firm. His footage was classified evidence related to ongoing national security operations. The memory card, his notes, his interviews, all of it was seized. His home was searched. His cloud backups were accessed and deleted. Every piece of evidence he had collected was confiscated or destroyed. He was offered a choice: sign a non-disclosure agreement and receive a substantial payment for his consultation on a federal project, or face prosecution for trespassing in restricted areas, interfering with federal operations, and a dozen other charges that would ensure he spent years in federal prison. Jacob signed. The payment was enough to live comfortably for the rest of his life, provided he never spoke about what he'd found beneath the mountains. His social media accounts were deleted. His documentary series was removed from all platforms. Within a week, it was as if Jacob Merrin, professional skeptic and debunker, had never existed. He moved to a small apartment in a city far from any mountains. He didn't do photography anymore. He didn't investigate anything. He lived quietly, anonymously, trying to forget what he'd seen. But late at night, he would sometimes hear his own voice echoing in the darkness of his bedroom. Jacob, Jacob, Jacob. The mimics had learned his name. They would remember him, even if the world was forced to forget. As for what happened to the evidence, officially, nothing happened. Officially, there was no evidence. Officially, Jacob Merrin had suffered a mental health crisis during a solo hiking trip and had been treated with compassion and discretion by concerned authorities. But 3 hikers, exploring off-trail areas near Roan Mountain the following spring, found something odd: an abandoned backpack containing a damaged camera and a memory card. They powered on the camera. They saw the footage, and before they could decide what to do with it, men in dark uniforms arrived at their homes. The footage was confiscated. The hikers were interviewed separately and strongly encouraged to forget what they'd seen. But one of them had been smart. Before the agents arrived, she had uploaded 30 seconds of footage to an obscure file-sharing site, posting it without comment or context. The video made its way through conspiracy forums and paranormal websites. Most dismissed it as obvious CGI. Some saw it as the best hoax they'd ever encountered. A very few recognised it for what it was: genuine evidence of something that lives beneath the Appalachian Mountains. The final frame of that leaked footage shows what Jacob saw in his last moments in the tunnel. A massive metallic door, smooth and impossibly perfect, set into the deepest part of the mountain. A hand reaching toward the camera, pale, with 6 fingers, the joints bending in ways that suggest something not quite human, and words carved into the stone beside the door, weathered by countless years. We were here first. The conspiracy theorists were right. The warnings were justified. The cover-up was real. And Jacob Merrin, the man who went to debunk the myths, learned the truth that destroyed his life. Some things are buried for a reason. Some corridors were never meant to be explored, and some questions should never be answered. The Appalachian Mountains keep their secrets. The government maintains its silence. The creatures beneath continue their patient waiting. And occasionally, someone else goes looking for truth in the oldest mountains in America. Most of them don't come back. The ones who do are never the same. Imagine discovering that your government has been lying to you about the greatest threat humanity has ever faced. Imagine learning that while officials tell you everything is normal, they've been secretly building underground cities for themselves and their families. Imagine realizing that 300 million Americans have been marked as acceptable losses in a disaster that's not a matter of if, but when. This is a story based on real geological science, actual government protocols, and the terrifying possibility that the truth about Yellowstone is being hidden from you right now. What happens when the greatest natural disaster in human history has been predicted, planned for, and hidden from the public? When a junior geologist stumbles upon evidence that the Yellowstone supervolcano isn't dormant, it's being managed. He discovers that some truths are worth killing for. Special thanks to Nicola for this incredible story concept and detailed research that made this narrative possible. Yellowstone National Park Monitoring Station, October the 15th, 2014. The coffee had gone cold hours ago, but Eli Grant barely noticed. His eyes were locked on the seismic readout scrolling across his monitor, watching patterns that shouldn't exist dance across the screen like digital ghosts. At 24, fresh out of graduate school with a geology degree from Colorado State, Eli had spent the last 3 months as a USGS intern learning that monitoring America's most dangerous supervolcano was mostly routine data collection, punctuated by moments of sheer terror. This was one of those moments. The microquakes were coming from depths that made his stomach turn. 15 miles down, deeper than any recorded activity in Yellowstone's 30-year digital monitoring history. The frequency was wrong too, clustered in tight bursts rather than the random scatter typical of normal geothermal activity. Each tremor registered between 1.2 and 1.8 on the Richter scale, small enough to be dismissed individually, but together they painted a picture that made Eli's hand shake as he reached for his phone. Before he could dial his supervisor, the screen flickered. The anomalous readings vanished, replaced by a steady green line indicating normal background activity. A automated message popped up. Calibration complete. Data archived. Eli stared at the empty screen. 15 minutes of unprecedented deep seismic activity had just been erased as if it never existed. He quickly navigated to the backup servers, his fingers flying across the keyboard with increasing desperation. The raw data files were gone. The automated alerts had been cleared. Even the emergency notification logs showed nothing but routine system maintenance. "Working late again, kid?" Eli spun around to find Karen Holt standing in the doorway, her park ranger uniform still crisp despite the late hour. At 52, Karen had been patrolling Yellowstone's backcountry for over 2 decades, and her weathered face carried the kind of knowledge that came from watching the park's moods change with the seasons. "Karen, do you feel anything about an hour ago? Any tremors?" She studied his face carefully before stepping into the room and closing the door behind her. "You saw something on the monitors?" "Deep quakes, deeper than anything in the database, but they're gone now, scrubbed clean like they never happened." Karen was quiet for a long moment, her eyes fixed on the sanitized readouts. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight Eli had never heard before. "How long have you been working here, Eli?" 3 months. "Long enough to know what you're looking at, not long enough to know what you're not supposed to see." She pulled up a chair beside him. "Let me ask you something. You know why they put the monitoring station here instead of closer to the caldera?" Eli shrugged. "Better communication links, I assumed. Easier access for maintenance." "That's what they tell the interns." Karen's fingers drummed against the desk. "The real reason is that certain types of data collection work better from a distance. Gives you time to curate what goes into the public record." The implication hit Eli like a physical blow. "Are you saying they're hiding seismic data?" "I'm saying that 23 years of watching this place has taught me that Yellowstone keeps secrets, and some people are very invested in keeping those secrets buried." She stood up, her hand resting briefly on his shoulder. "Don't start asking questions you're not ready to answer, Eli. This park isn't just about geysers." After she left, Eli sat alone in the monitoring station, staring at the clean, normal readouts. But Karen's warning had sparked something dangerous. Curiosity. He pulled up the archived database and began searching for gaps, periods where data might have been scrubbed before. What he found made his pulse quicken. Small deletions in 2009, 2004, and 1997. Always deep seismic activity. Always erased within hours of being recorded. Always during periods when public attention was focused elsewhere. Economic crashes, natural disasters, political scandals. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidental. Eli spent the rest of the night copying every piece of raw data he could access onto external drives, working with the methodical precision of someone who understood that some opportunities only came once. By dawn, he had assembled a fragmentary picture of Yellowstone's hidden activity dating back 15 years. The supervolcano wasn't dormant. It was being watched, monitored, and most importantly hidden from public view. As the sun rose over the Yellowstone River, Eli Grant became the first person outside the conspiracy to see the full scope of what was coming. What he didn't know was that his discovery had already been noted by systems designed to catch exactly this kind of unauthorized access. In a secure facility 300 miles away, automated alerts were already being generated, and decisions were being made about what to do with a curious young geologist who had seen too much. Chapter 1. The Official Story. Yellowstone National Park Headquarters, March 22nd, 2015. The press briefing room was packed with reporters from every major network, their cameras trained on the panel of scientists seated behind a table adorned with official USGS and National Park Service seals. Outside, early spring snow dusted the peaks surrounding Mammoth Hot Springs, but inside the room, the atmosphere was warm with the heat of television lights and simmering questions about Yellowstone's recent activity. Eli stood at the back of the room, his USGS badge giving him access to the media event despite his junior status. In the 5 months since he'd first witnessed the data scrubbing, he'd kept his head down and his mouth shut, but he'd also kept watching. The patterns were becoming clearer and more disturbing with each passing week. Chief Park Scientist Janet Morrison stepped up to the microphone, her grey hair pulled back in a severe bun that matched her no-nonsense expression. "Good morning. I want to address the speculation that's been circulating online regarding recent seismic activity in Yellowstone National Park." Eli noticed how she avoided mentioning the source of that speculation, a viral video showing hundreds of elk and bison streaming out of the Lamar Valley in what appeared to be a coordinated exodus. The footage had been taken by a tourist 3 weeks earlier and had garnered over 2 million views before park officials managed to provide alternative explanations. Based on our continuous monitoring of the Yellowstone volcanic system, Morrison continued, I can state categorically that no eruption is imminent. The seismic activity recorded over the past month falls well within normal parameters for this geologically active region. A reporter from CNN raised her hand. But what about the animal migrations? Local ranchers are reporting unusual behaviour in wildlife populations. Seasonal migration patterns can vary significantly based on weather conditions, food availability, and natural population cycles, Morrison replied smoothly. What some observers have interpreted as unusual behaviour is actually quite normal for this time of year. Eli bit back the urge to laugh. He'd seen the internal memos describing the animal movements as unprecedented and potentially indicative of subsurface environmental changes. The scientists on this panel knew exactly what was causing the animals to flee, but they were standing in front of cameras and lying about it with practiced ease. The questions continued for another 20 minutes, each one deflected with rehearsed responses that provided just enough technical detail to sound authoritative while revealing absolutely nothing of substance. As the briefing ended and reporters filed out, Eli lingered near the back of the room, watching the scientists pack up their materials. Impressive performance. Eli turned to find a man in his 40s wearing a FEMA windbreaker, his identification badge hanging from a lanyard around his neck. Deputy Director Marcus Webb, according to the credential. I'm sorry? The briefing. Very professional. Of course, the real challenge isn't managing the press, it's managing the logistics. Webb's smile was friendly, but his eyes remained cold. You're Eli Grant, aren't you? The intern who's been asking interesting questions. Eli's mouth went dry. I don't know what you mean. Database queries at odd hours, unusual download activity, IT security flags that kind of behaviour automatically. Webb stepped closer, lowering his voice. Don't worry. Curiosity is natural in your line of work, but there are some areas where curiosity can become problematic. Are you threatening me? I'm offering advice. FEMA has been conducting training exercises in this region for several months now. Interagency coordination, emergency response protocols, that sort of thing. You might have noticed our vehicles around the park. Eli had noticed. Black SUVs and unmarked trucks had been appearing at various locations throughout Yellowstone, always accompanied by personnel who claimed to be conducting routine training exercises. The timing seemed suspicious. Why increase emergency preparedness training just as seismic activity was being actively suppressed from public records? What kind of training? Webb's smile widened. Zone 5 evacuation protocols. Very comprehensive, very necessary. He handed Eli a business card. If you ever want to know more about emergency preparedness, give me a call. But remember, some knowledge comes with responsibilities. After Webb walked away, Eli stood alone in the empty briefing room, turning the card over in his hands. Zone 5 evacuation protocols. He'd never heard the term before, despite his security clearance and access to most FEMA documentation. That night, he spent hours searching through official databases, finding references to Zones 1 through 4, but nothing about Zone 5. Whatever Webb was talking about, it existed outside the normal chain of command and public accountability. The realization sent a chill down Eli's spine that had nothing to do with the late spring snow falling outside his apartment window. 3 days later, Karen Holt found him in the monitoring station, hunched over his computer with the intensity of someone racing against time. You're digging deeper, she observed, not bothering to make it a question. Someone has to. They're lying to everyone, Karen. The seismic data, the animal behaviour, the FEMA exercises, none of it adds up to the story they're telling the public. Karen closed the door and activated the white noise generator that was supposedly used to prevent electronic eavesdropping during sensitive conferences. What do you know about the Deep Bore project? Never heard of it. Officially, it never existed. Unofficially, it was a joint USGS military operation that ran from 2008 to 2012. The cover story was installation of advanced seismic monitoring equipment in previously inaccessible areas of the park. And the real story? Pressure venting? They were drilling down to the magma chamber and installing systems designed to release pressure in controlled amounts, potentially delaying or preventing a catastrophic eruption. Eli stared at her. That's actually brilliant. Why would they hide something like that? Because it didn't work. The magma chamber is too large, too unstable. The venting systems were supposed to buy us decades. Instead, they may have accelerated the timeline. Karen's face was grim. One of the contractors died during the installation phase. Officially, it was an industrial accident. Unofficially, he was murdered to prevent him from talking about what he'd discovered down there. What did he discover? That the eruption isn't a matter of if, Eli. It's a matter of when. And when is a lot sooner than anyone is willing to admit publicly. As Karen left him alone with this revelation, Eli found himself staring at the sanitized seismic readouts with new understanding. The data scrubbing wasn't just about hiding Yellowstone's activity from the public. It was about hiding the failure of a desperate attempt to prevent the greatest natural disaster in human history. And somewhere, people with access to the real data were making plans that didn't include the 300 million Americans living in the path of destruction. Chapter 2. The Elite Plan. USGS Regional Office, Denver, September 14th, 2016. The security badge scanner beeped as Eli swiped his credential, granting him access to the restricted archives beneath the Denver Federal Building. 18 months had passed since his first glimpse of the conspiracy, and his official duties had gradually shifted from basic monitoring to special projects, a euphemism for working on data sets that required higher security clearances and absolute discretion. What his supervisors didn't know was that Eli had been using his expanded access to piece together a puzzle that grew more terrifying with each new fragment of information he uncovered. The file he'd been looking for was buried in a section marked HLT 2030, nestled between routine geological surveys and budget projections for monitoring equipment. Hazard level threshold 2030. The designation meant nothing to most people, but Eli had learned to recognize the bureaucratic camouflage used to hide the most sensitive documents. He opened the file with trembling fingers. The first page was a summary that made his vision blur. Probabilistic eruption window, 2028 to 2032. Confidence interval, 94.7%. Recommended public disclosure timeline, none. Eli had to read the last line 3 times before its meaning sank in. They had narrowed down the eruption timeline to a 4-year window with near certainty, and the official recommendation was to tell the public nothing. The next section detailed evacuation protocols that divided the American population into 2 distinct categories. Tier 1 included federal government personnel, military leadership, critical infrastructure managers, and selected scientific and medical professionals, approximately 2.3 million people, who would receive advance warning and priority evacuation to designated safe zones. Tier 2 encompassed everyone else, 327 million Americans whose evacuation status was listed with brutal honesty as no viable plan. Eli scrolled through page after page of logistical nightmares and resource calculations. The ash fallout zone would render most of the continental United States uninhabitable for years. The immediate kill zone, a radius of approximately 700 miles from the eruption site, would experience pyroclastic flows, toxic gas emissions, and complete ecological collapse. Even with advance warning, there weren't enough resources to evacuate more than a fraction of the affected population. But the most damning section came toward the end. Cross-reference construction projects that had been authorized and funded over the past decade. Underground facilities in Colorado, Utah, and South Dakota, officially described as continuity of government installations or strategic resource storage sites. The locations formed a clear pattern, far enough from Yellowstone to avoid the immediate devastation, supplied with independent power and air filtration systems, and sized to accommodate the Tier 1 population for extended periods. None of the facilities were located in Wyoming or Montana, the states that would bear the brunt of the initial eruption. The people living in those areas, including Eli himself, were considered acceptable losses. A sound in the corridor outside made Eli freeze. Footsteps were approaching the archive room, accompanied by the low murmur of voices. He quickly photographed the most critical pages with his phone, replaced the file, and pretended to be reviewing mundane seismic reports. The door opened to reveal Deputy Director Webb and a woman Eli didn't recognize, both wearing the kind of serious expressions that accompanied discussions of national security. "Grant," Webb nodded, "working late again, I see." "Just catching up on some routine analysis," Eli replied, hoping his voice sounded steadier than he felt. The woman studied him with interest. "You're the intern who's been flagged for unusual database access patterns. I prefer to think of myself as thorough." Webb laughed, but the sound held no humour. "Thoroughness is admirable. Discretion is essential. I trust you understand the distinction." After they left, Eli sat alone in the archive room, staring at the photos on his phone. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. A small group of government officials and scientists had known for years that Yellowstone was approaching a catastrophic eruption, and their response had been to save themselves while leaving everyone else to die. The scope of the betrayal was breathtaking. Hundreds of millions of people were going about their daily lives, making plans for the future, raising children and building careers, completely unaware that their government had already written them off as collateral damage in a disaster that could be predicted but not prevented. That night, Eli returned to his apartment in Gardner, Montana, with the decision crystallizing in his mind. The evidence he'd gathered was enough to expose the conspiracy, but he needed more. Documentation that would be impossible to dismiss or discredit. He also needed a way to get the information to journalists who couldn't be intimidated or bought off. What he didn't know was that his activities in the archive had been monitored in real time, and that his phone's camera had triggered security algorithms designed to detect unauthorized photography of classified documents. By the time he fell asleep that night, plans were already being made to ensure that Eli Grant's investigation would end before it could threaten the carefully constructed wall of silence surrounding Yellowstone's deadly secret. Chapter 3: The Suppression. Gardner, Montana, November the 8th, 2016. Eli's apartment had been turned upside down with surgical precision. Furniture overturned, drawers pulled out and dumped, every electronic device missing or destroyed. But the most telling detail was what the intruders hadn't done. They'd left his television, his expensive hiking equipment, and the cash he kept in a kitchen drawer. This wasn't a random burglary. Someone had been looking for specific items and they'd found them. His laptop was gone. His external hard drives were missing. Even his backup thumb drives, hidden in a hollowed-out book, had been discovered and taken. Months of carefully gathered evidence had vanished in a single night, leaving behind only the photos on his phone. Photos he'd been smart enough to upload to a secure cloud storage account before going to bed. Eli stood in his wrecked living room, surveying the damage with a mixture of fear and determination. They'd sent a message: stop digging, or face consequences. But they'd also confirmed that his investigation was getting close to something they desperately wanted to keep hidden. His phone buzzed with a text from Karen: "Meet me at Mammoth Terraces, North Side, come alone." 30 minutes later, Eli found Karen standing on the limestone terraces that gave Mammoth Hot Springs its name, her park ranger uniform stark against the white mineral deposits. Steam rose from the thermal features around them, creating an otherworldly landscape that felt appropriate for the conversation they were about to have. "They hit your place," she said without preamble. "How did you know?" "Because they're watching all of us now. Anyone who's asked too many questions, anyone who's shown too much interest in the wrong data." Karen gestured toward the thermal features. "You see these springs? They've been active for thousands of years, but their flow patterns have changed dramatically in the past 18 months. The thermal system is destabilizing. Why are you telling me this? Because you deserve to know what you've stumbled into. Karen's expression was grim. I told you I worked on the deep bore project. What I didn't tell you is why I really left. She led him away from the main viewing area, down a maintenance trail that wound behind the limestone formations. The drilling operation was based out of a temporary facility near the Norris Geyser Basin. Officially, we were installing seismic monitoring equipment at depth that would provide better data about magma chamber activity. But that wasn't the real purpose. The real purpose was to tap into the magma chamber and create controlled release valves. The theory was sound. If you could bleed off pressure gradually, you might prevent a catastrophic eruption, or at least delay it long enough to develop better evacuation procedures. They emerged onto a small plateau that offered a clear view of the valley below. In the distance, Eli could see the geometric lines of roads and buildings that marked human presence in the wilderness, tiny and fragile against the vast landscape. What went wrong? Everything. The magma chamber is far more complex than the models predicted. Instead of bleeding off pressure, the venting systems created new pathways for thermal activity. The timeline for eruption may have been accelerated rather than delayed. Karen pulled a small device from her pocket, an encrypted satellite phone that Eli recognized as military hardware. Tom Rodriguez was the lead contractor on the drilling team. Geothermal engineer, 23 years of experience, 3 kids. He started asking questions about why the pressure readings weren't matching the theoretical models. What happened to him? Vehicle accident on a mountain road. Lost control on a curve, went over a cliff. Very tragic. Very convenient. Karen's jaw tightened. Except Tom was one of the most careful drivers I'd ever met, and he'd driven that road hundreds of times. Also, his personal notes about the pressure anomalies disappeared from his trailer the same night he died. The implication was clear and terrifying. Eli was looking at a conspiracy that had already committed murder to protect its secrets. His ransacked apartment wasn't just a warning, it was a preview of what could happen if he continued to threaten their operational security. Why haven't you gone public with this? With what? A story about a secret government project with no documentation, a convenient accident with no witnesses, and seismic data that gets scrubbed from official records. Karen shook her head. They've been very careful to keep everything compartmentalized. Most of the people involved only know pieces of the puzzle. But together we know enough to expose them. Together we know enough to get killed. Karen handed him the satellite phone. This is encrypted and routes through military satellites. They can't monitor it easily. If something happens to me, use it to contact investigative journalists. The access codes are programmed in. As they walked back toward the main trail, Eli felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. He was now part of a resistance movement he'd never asked to join, fighting against a conspiracy that had resources and ruthlessness he could barely comprehend. That night, he uploaded everything he'd learned to multiple secure cloud accounts, created encrypted copies of all his evidence, and began drafting detailed summaries that could be understood by journalists without scientific backgrounds. If something happened to him, the truth would still survive. What he didn't know was that Karen Holt had already been marked for elimination, and that his own name had moved to the top of a very short list of people who knew too much to be allowed to live. The conspiracy had spent years perfecting the art of making problematic people disappear without raising suspicions. Eli Grant was about to discover just how efficient they'd become. Chapter 4. The False Flag. Lamar Valley, Yellowstone National Park, June 15th, 2017. The video went viral within hours of being uploaded. Shot on a tourist's smartphone from the Lamar Valley overlook, it showed something that no park official could easily explain away. Nearly 1,000 bison streaming eastward in a coordinated exodus that looked more like a military retreat than seasonal migration. Eli watched the footage for the 12th time, pausing on frames that showed the animals' behaviour. Their ears were pinned back, their movements urgent and purposeful. These weren't animals wandering to new grazing areas. They were fleeing something that had triggered every survival instinct evolution had given them. The official response came within 6 hours. Park spokeswoman Janet Morrison appeared on CNN to explain that large herbivore migrations were completely normal, and that social media was creating panic over natural phenomena that occur regularly in Yellowstone. What Morrison didn't mention was that the bison were fleeing from a section of the park that had been closed to public access for the past 3 months. The Norrisback Basin, officially under restoration after minor geothermal changes, was actually experiencing subsurface temperatures that had increased by nearly 40 degrees Celsius in the past year. Eli had seen the classified reports. New fumaroles were opening weekly. The ground temperature was rising so rapidly that park maintenance crews couldn't approach the monitoring equipment without protective suits. Most telling of all, the area was showing magnetic anomalies consistent with massive metallic intrusions, exactly what you'd expect if the magma chamber was rising toward the surface. His phone buzzed with a message from Karen. "Need to show you something. Tonight. Usual place." They met after midnight at the Mammoth Terraces, their breath visible in the cold mountain air. Karen looked haggard, her face showing the strain of months spent living with dangerous knowledge. "I've been monitoring radio traffic from the restricted zones," she said without preamble. "FEMA has been conducting something called Operation Continuity. Not training exercises, actual deployment." "Deployment of what?" "Command and control infrastructure. They've been installing communication arrays, power systems, and what sounds like permanent housing facilities." Karen pulled out a topographic map marked with red circles. "All of these locations correspond to abandoned Cold War bunkers or natural cave systems. They're building something underground." Eli studied the map. The marked locations formed a rough circle around the Yellowstone caldera, each one positioned outside the immediate blast zone but close enough to maintain operational oversight of the area. How many people could these facilities support? Based on the supply manifests I've been able to intercept, maybe 2,000 people per facility. Enough for essential government personnel and their families, plus a skeleton crew to maintain basic infrastructure. The scope of the deception was staggering. While telling the public that Yellowstone posed no immediate threat, the government was quietly building underground cities designed to preserve a small fraction of the population through the greatest natural disaster in human history. "I want to see one of these facilities." Karen shook her head. "Too dangerous. They've got military-grade security at all the sites now." "Then how do we prove any of this exists?" "We don't. Not directly." Karen handed him a small device that looked like a modified GPS unit. "But we can document the construction activity. This is a ground-penetrating radar unit, modified to detect large underground structures. If we can map the facilities from the surface, we can prove they exist without having to penetrate their security." 2 nights later, they drove to a remote area near the Shoshone National Forest, following Forest Service roads that weren't marked on any public maps. The official designation was a wildlife research station, but the facilities visible from the access road looked more like a military installation than a scientific outpost. Chain-link fencing topped with razor wire surrounded the compound. Guard towers equipped with searchlights and what appeared to be automated weapon systems monitored the perimeter. Most telling of all, massive air conditioning units and ventilation systems indicated that whatever was happening here required significant life support infrastructure. Karen set up the ground-penetrating radar while Eli photographed everything he could see from their concealed position. The radar readings revealed the truth. Beneath the modest surface facilities lay a complex that extended at least 5 levels underground, with enough space to house thousands of people for extended periods. "My God," Eli whispered as he studied the readouts. "It's like an underground city." "One of at least 6 that we know of," Karen replied. "And this is just what they're building in Wyoming and Montana. Intelligence suggests similar facilities are under construction throughout the western United States." As they packed up their equipment, Eli felt a mixture of vindication and terror. They now had proof that the government was secretly preparing for a Yellowstone eruption, while publicly denying any threat existed. But they also had evidence of a conspiracy so vast and well-funded that challenging it openly would be tantamount to suicide. The drive back to Gardner was tense and quiet. Both of them understood that they'd crossed a line tonight, moving from passive observation to active intelligence gathering. The people behind the conspiracy would not tolerate this kind of direct surveillance for long. Karen was right to be worried. Unknown to either of them, their activities had been monitored by satellite surveillance systems designed to detect exactly this kind of unauthorized reconnaissance. Facial recognition algorithms had identified them both, and their vehicle's license plate had been flagged in law enforcement databases across the region. Within hours, orders would be issued for their immediate apprehension and detention. The conspiracy had decided that Karen Holt and Eli Grant had become too dangerous to remain free. But first, they had to be isolated from any support networks or escape routes. The plan that had been set in motion would ensure that when they disappeared, no one would think to look for them until it was far too late to matter. Chapter 5. The Smoking Gun. Secure conference room, undisclosed location, August 3rd, 2017. The recording device was smaller than a matchbox, designed to look like a routine equipment monitoring sensor of the type found throughout government facilities. Eli had placed it in the ventilation system of conference room C7 3 hours earlier, using his maintenance access codes to enter the secure wing of the Denver Federal Building. What he captured on that device would become the smoking gun that proved everything he'd suspected about the Yellowstone conspiracy. The voices on the recording were clearly identifiable. Deputy Director Webb from FEMA, Assistant Secretary of Interior Patricia Vance, and at least 2 other officials whose identities Eli couldn't immediately determine. Their conversation was conducted with the casual tone of people who believed they were speaking in complete privacy. "The latest projections show we're ahead of schedule," Webb's voice came through clearly. "Thermal expansion in the Norris sector is accelerating faster than the models predicted." "How much faster?" Vance asked. 18 to 24 months ahead of the original timeline. We may be looking at a 2029 event rather than 2031. The sound of papers shuffling was audible before another voice joined the conversation. "The infrastructure projects are proceeding on schedule, but we'll need to accelerate the relocation of essential personnel if the timeline has moved up." "What about public disclosure?" Vance asked. Webb's laugh was bitter. "Public disclosure remains a non-option. We've run every scenario through the simulation models. Even with a full year of advance warning, we couldn't evacuate more than 15% of the affected population. The interstate system would collapse within hours, supply chains would break down completely, and we'd face massive social unrest that would interfere with Tier 1 evacuation procedures." "So we maintain the current posture?" "We maintain the lie," Webb corrected. "Continue the public briefings about normal seismic activity. Continue dismissing online speculation as conspiracy theories. And most importantly, continue the media relationships that keep investigative journalists focused on other stories." Eli's hands trembled as he listened to the casual discussion of abandoning hundreds of millions of people to die. These weren't comic book villains plotting world domination. They were mid-level government bureaucrats who had decided that preserving their own lives and positions was more important than honouring their oath to serve the public. The recording continued with logistical discussions that were even more damning. Supply caches were being positioned at the underground facilities. Communication networks that would remain operational during and after the eruption were being tested. Even arrangements for maintaining genetic diversity in the post-eruption population were being planned with clinical efficiency. "What about the monitoring station personnel?" an unidentified voice asked. "Some of them are asking uncomfortable questions." "We're handling that," Webb replied. "Enhanced security protocols, selective information sharing, and when necessary, personnel reassignments to less sensitive positions." "What about the ones who have already seen too much?" "Problem solved," Webb's voice carried a note of finality that made Eli's stomach turn. "The park ranger who was asking questions about the deep bore project will be transferred to a remote station in Alaska next week. A routine reassignment that gets her away from Yellowstone and limits her access to sensitive information. Karen. They were talking about Karen, and Eli knew with sickening certainty that her reassignment would be permanent in ways that had nothing to do with Park Service bureaucracy. The meeting concluded with assignments and timelines that painted a clear picture of a conspiracy in its final phases. The underground facilities would be fully operational by 2028. Essential personnel would begin training exercises that were actually disguised evacuations by early 2029, and the public would remain completely unaware until the eruption made further secrecy impossible. Eli retrieved the recording device later that night, his heart pounding as he navigated the empty corridors of the federal building. The evidence he now possessed was explosive enough to bring down the entire conspiracy, if he could find a way to get it to journalists who couldn't be intimidated or discredited. But first he had to warn Karen about her impending reassignment. He tried calling her cell phone but got no answer. Her ranger station reported that she was off duty and couldn't be reached for routine inquiries. Growing increasingly worried, Eli drove to her apartment in Mammoth Hot Springs, only to find it dark and apparently empty. Karen's supervisor, when Eli finally tracked him down, was apologetic but unhelpful. Officer Holt has been temporarily assigned to a special project in Alaska. She left this morning on a charter flight. Very sudden, but you know how it is with Park Service priorities. Eli knew exactly how it was. Karen Holt had become a liability, and liabilities were being eliminated with bureaucratic efficiency. Her disappearance was a warning and a preview of his own fate if he continued to threaten the conspiracy's operational security. That night, he uploaded the recording to multiple secure servers and began reaching out to investigative journalists whose work suggested they couldn't be easily intimidated. The evidence was now beyond their ability to suppress completely, but Eli understood that possessing it had made him the most dangerous man in America. He was no longer just a witness to the conspiracy. He was the only person outside their organization who could prove it existed, and that made him a target that couldn't be allowed to remain free. Chapter 6. The Countdown. Gardner, Montana, November 12, 2017. The email from ProPublica journalist Michael Chen arrived at 3:47 a.m, marked with encryption protocols that indicated he'd taken Eli's warnings about government surveillance seriously. The message was brief, but electrifying. Audio verified by 3 independent sources. Document analysis confirms authenticity. Ready to publish. Needs secure meeting to discuss protection protocols. Eli had been living as a fugitive in his own life for 3 months, changing locations nightly and communicating only through encrypted channels. The strain was showing. He'd lost 20 pounds, developed chronic insomnia, and started checking his rearview mirror obsessively whenever he drove. But Chen's message confirmed that the months of careful evidence gathering had finally produced results that couldn't be dismissed or discredited. What Eli didn't know was that his encrypted communications had been compromised for weeks, and that every message he'd sent to journalists was being monitored by the same people he was trying to expose. The conspiracy's response was swift and multi-pronged. Within hours of Chen's message, every major news network received exclusive briefings from USGS officials debunking dangerous misinformation about Yellowstone. The briefings included carefully edited seismic data, testimonials from concerned scientists about the psychological damage caused by eruption rumours, and veiled threats about the national security implications of spreading geological panic. Chen's editor killed the story before it could be published. The official reason was insufficient corroboration from government sources. The real reason became clear when Chen contacted Eli through secure channels. ProPublica's major donors had received calls from federal officials suggesting that publishing unverified geological speculation could affect the organization's non-profit status. But the conspiracy had underestimated the modern information landscape. Eli's evidence had been distributed to dozens of journalists, bloggers, and citizen researchers, while mainstream media outlets could be pressured into silence. The decentralized nature of online publishing made complete suppression impossible. On November the 15th, the story broke simultaneously across 17 different platforms. Independent journalists published the recordings. Geology professors confirmed the technical details. Former government employees provided additional context about the classified facilities. Within 48 hours, #Yellowstone Conspiracy was trending globally. The government's response was predictable and desperate. Official spokespeople dismissed the evidence as sophisticated disinformation designed to undermine public confidence in scientific institutions. The recordings were declared fabricated using advanced audio manipulation technology. Alternative explanations were provided for every piece of evidence Eli had gathered, but the dam had broken. Whistleblowers within the conspiracy began coming forward with additional documentation. Satellite images of the underground facilities appeared online. Construction workers who had built the secret bunkers shared their stories. Karen Holt, who had been held at a debriefing facility in Alaska, was released and immediately went public with her testimony about the Deep Bore project. The revelation that the government had been planning to abandon 300 million Americans to die while saving only a privileged few sparked the largest protests in American history. Demonstrations erupted in every major city. Congressional hearings were demanded. International allies expressed outrage at being kept in the dark about a disaster that would affect global climate and agriculture. Most importantly, real evacuation planning finally began. With the truth exposed, it became impossible to maintain the fiction that Yellowstone posed no threat. Scientists worked around the clock to develop actual emergency response procedures. International cooperation emerged as other countries offered to assist with evacuation and resettlement efforts. Chapter 7. The Final Message. Yellowstone National Park, January 20th, 2029. Eli stood on the Lamar Valley overlook, watching steam rise from thermal features that had doubled in intensity over the past 18 months. The park was nearly empty now. Evacuations had begun 6 months earlier when seismic activity had become impossible to hide. The animals had fled long ago, following instincts older than human civilization. His phone buzzed with an encrypted message from the Global Yellowstone Monitoring Consortium, an international scientific collaboration that had formed after the conspiracy's exposure. Seismic precursors accelerating. Event window now estimated at 72 to 96 hours. Final evacuation protocols activated. The irony wasn't lost on him. The same evidence that the conspiracy had tried to suppress for decades was now being used to save millions of lives. The underground facilities that had been built for a privileged few were being converted into evacuation centres for ordinary families. The communication networks designed to preserve government continuity were now coordinating the largest humanitarian operation in human history. Not everyone could be saved. The logistics were still overwhelming, but transparency had enabled genuine preparation instead of elite preservation. International agreements had been signed to relocate climate refugees. Agricultural systems had been modified to function with altered growing conditions. Supply chains had been restructured to survive massive disruption. Eli's satellite phone rang. Karen's voice came through clearly from her position at the Evacuation Coordination Center in Denver. "Final transport leaves Gardner in 30 minutes, she reported. "You need to be on it." "I'll be there," Eli replied, but he remained standing on the overlook for several more minutes. Below him, Yellowstone spread out in its terrible beauty, a landscape that had remained largely unchanged for thousands of years, about to be transformed by forces that made human concerns seem trivial. His phone's camera was still recording as he delivered his final message. "This is Eli Grant, reporting from Yellowstone National Park on January 20th, 2029. In approximately 3 days, this place will become ground zero for the largest volcanic eruption in human history. But unlike the conspiracy originally planned, this won't be a secret apocalypse that kills hundreds of millions while saving a few thousand elites. Because the truth came out, we've had time to prepare. Not perfectly, Not completely, but honestly. The people fleeing this region know what's coming and why. The international community is ready to help. The aftermath will be terrible, but it won't be hidden, and it won't be used to justify abandoning the principles of democratic society. If you're watching this from the future, remember that transparency saved lives. Remember that ordinary people, when given truth instead of lies, are capable of extraordinary cooperation. And remember that the greatest disasters are always made worse by the people who try to profit from them instead of preventing them. As he walked back to his truck for the final drive to the evacuation point, Eli felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Not for avoiding the catastrophe, that was beyond human power to prevent, but hope that when the crisis came, humanity would face it together rather than divided by the lies of those who value their own survival above everyone else's. Epilogue. The quiet after the storm. New Geneva, International Reconstruction Zone, January 20th, 2034. 5 years after the Yellowstone eruption, Eli Grant stood before the International Truth and Reconciliation Commission, delivering testimony that would help ensure such a conspiracy could never again threaten global security. The hearing was being broadcast live to millions of survivors in refugee communities across 6 continents. The eruption had been as devastating as predicted. Ash fallout had disrupted global agriculture for 3 years. Climate patterns had shifted dramatically, and large areas of North America remained uninhabitable. But because the truth had emerged in time, the disaster had brought out humanity's cooperative instincts rather than its destructive ones. The Yellowstone conspiracy taught us that the greatest threats to human survival aren't natural disasters. Eli concluded his testimony. They're the institutions that respond to those disasters by protecting themselves at the expense of everyone else. Transparency isn't just an ideal, it's a survival strategy. In the audience, Karen Holt nodded her approval. She now directed the Global Early Warning Network, an international organisation dedicated to ensuring that geological threats could never again be hidden from the public. Around the world, the underground facilities originally built for elite preservation had been converted into research stations, museums and memorials dedicated to democratic accountability. The Yellowstone conspiracy had been exposed just in time to save millions of lives, but more importantly, it had revealed the difference between a society that prepares for disaster together and one that allows the powerful to abandon everyone else when crisis strikes. As Eli walked out of the hearing room into the rebuilt world beyond, he carried with him the knowledge that sometimes the most dangerous secrets are the ones we tell ourselves we're keeping for everyone's own good. The truth, no matter how terrifying, is always preferable to a lie that serves only the few at the expense of the many. The Pressure Files. What really happened to the Ocean Gate submersible. Hey everyone! Before we dive into tonight's story, I want to ask you something that would really help the channel grow. If you're enjoying this documentary, please consider using your hype points on this video. It helps us more than you possibly know, and allows us to keep bringing you these deep dive investigations. Also, if you're up for it, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from, but only if you want to share. Now let's get into tonight's investigation. A massive thank you to Vortex and Scarlet Widow for submitting this idea. This is exactly the kind of story we live for here at Sleep Theories, where documented truth is stranger than fiction. On June 18th, 2023, 5 people descended toward the wreck of the Titanic in a submersible called Titan. None of them would return alive. The world was told it was a tragic accident, a catastrophic implosion caused by structural failure. But what if the official story is incomplete? What if there's evidence that something else happened down there in the crushing darkness, something that powerful institutions have worked very hard to keep quiet? Tonight we're going to examine the data they never released, the messages that disappeared, and the acoustic anomalies that don't match the narrative you've been told. This is the story of the pressure files, and what really happened to the Ocean Gate submersible. Part 1. The file that started everything. June 26th, 2023. 2 days after the Titan submersible was officially declared lost with all hands, a maritime analyst named Elias North received an email that would change everything. Elias wasn't a household name, but in the tight-knit world of deep-sea exploration and maritime safety analysis, he was respected. He'd spent 15 years working with various ocean research institutions, analysing dive data, and consulting on submersible safety protocols. The email came from an anonymous address, a randomly generated string of letters and numbers that would later prove impossible to trace. There was no message in the body of the email, just a single attachment. The file was named exactly this: Titan_pressure_anomalies_0519-0618.xlsx. Elias almost deleted it. Anonymous files from unknown sources were usually spam or worse. But something about the specificity of that file name made him pause. The dates caught his attention immediately. May 19th through June 18th. That ending date was the day Titan went down. He opened the file. What he found inside was extraordinary. Dozens upon dozens of entries, technical readings that appeared to be genuine Ocean Gate internal logs. Pressure readings, acoustic measurements, hull stress, calculations, things that should never have left the company's secure servers. Each entry was time-stamped, geo-tagged with coordinates, and included detailed technical annotations. Elias spent the first hour simply verifying what he could. The formatting matched Ocean Gate's known data structure. The technical terminology was correct. The coordinate readings aligned with known Titan dive locations from previous expeditions. Everything about the file screamed authenticity. But it was one specific entry that made his hands shake as he scrolled through the spreadsheet. June 18th, 0854, Coordinated Universal Time. Exactly the morning of the implosion, just minutes before Titan went silent. The entry read, Extremely Rapid Compression. Dash source, unknown, dash external origin. External origin. Not a hull failure, not an internal structural collapse, something from outside the submersible. Elias read the line again, then again. Then he started going through every other entry in the file, and what he discovered was even more disturbing. The pressure anomalies didn't start on June 18th. They went back weeks. There were irregular readings on multiple previous dives, entries that suggested Titan had been experiencing unexplained external pressure events long before its final journey. This contradicted everything the public had been told. The narrative was simple, almost reassuring in its clarity. Titan was an experimental submersible that had pushed its materials beyond safe limits. The hull failed. The occupants died instantly. Tragic, but explainable. A cautionary tale about innovation outpacing safety. But if this file was real, that story was incomplete at best, and deliberately misleading at worst. Elias saved 3 copies of the file to different secure locations, then began the most important investigation of his career. He had no idea that within weeks he would become one of the most sought after and simultaneously invisible figures in the deep-sea exploration community. And he definitely didn't know that powerful forces were already aware of what he'd received. Part 2. The Real Timeline. Before we go further into what Elias discovered, We need to establish the facts, the undisputed events that everyone agrees happened. Because the conspiracy here isn't about inventing fiction, it's about the spaces between the official facts, the gaps where uncomfortable questions live. OceanGate Expeditions was founded in 2009 by Stockton Rush and others. The company's mission was to make deep-sea exploration more accessible, to create submersibles that could take tourists and researchers to depths that had previously been accessible only to military or government-funded operations. It was an ambitious, even noble goal. The Titan itself was an unusual submersible. Unlike traditional designs that used heavy titanium spheres, Titan's passenger hull was made from carbon fibre and titanium. This made it lighter and theoretically capable of faster descents and ascents. But carbon fibre behaves differently under repeated pressure cycling than titanium. It doesn't fail gradually. When it fails catastrophically. Titan began making dives to the Titanic wreck site starting in 2021. The RMS Titanic rests at approximately 3,800 metres below the surface, about 2.5 miles down. At that depth, the pressure is roughly 375 times what we experience at sea level. Every square inch of surface area experiences thousands of pounds of force. The dive that ended in tragedy launched on June 18th, 2023. Aboard were 5 people: Stockton Rush, the CEO of OceanGate and the pilot; Hamish Harding, a British businessman and adventurer; Shahzada Dawood and his son Suleiman Dawood, a Pakistani businessman and his 19-year-old son; and Paul-Henri Nargiolet, a French deep-sea explorer who had visited the Titanic wreck more than 30 times. Titan lost contact with its support ship, the Polar Prince, 1 hour and 45 minutes into its descent. The last communication was a routine status message, then nothing. What followed was a massive search and rescue operation. Ships and aircraft from multiple nations converged on the area. The world watched and hoped. For days there was the possibility, however slim, that Titan was intact somewhere on the ocean floor, its occupants alive but unable to communicate. On June 22nd, debris was found near the Titanic wreck site. The pattern of the debris made it clear what had happened. Catastrophic implosion. The pressure hull had failed, and the implosion would have been instantaneous. The occupants would not have suffered. They would have died faster than their nervous systems could even register pain. Then came the detail that made Elias's anonymous file so significant. On June 28th, the United States Navy confirmed something remarkable. Their underwater acoustic monitoring system had detected what they called anomalous acoustic signatures at the time Titan went silent. In other words, the Navy had heard the implosion happen in real time. They'd known for days that Titan was lost, but they hadn't said anything publicly, supposedly to avoid compromising classified monitoring capabilities. That acoustic signature would become crucial to Elias's investigation. Part 3. The logs don't lie. Elias spent the next week doing something unusual for someone who received an anonymous leak. He tried to disprove it. He looked for any evidence that the file was fabricated, that someone had created an elaborate hoax. He contacted former OceanGate contractors through carefully worded inquiries that didn't reveal what he had. He cross-referenced the technical data with publicly available information about Titan specifications. Everything checked out. More disturbing, some of the technical details in the file matched, things that had never been made public. Specific serial numbers for sensors, internal code designations for monitoring systems, the kind of information that only someone with direct access to OceanGate systems would know. The pressure anomalies painted a disturbing picture. The file showed that Titan had experienced unexplained external pressure events on at least 6 separate occasions over the 3 weeks leading up to the final dive. These weren't the normal, gradual pressure increases you'd expect during descent. These were sudden spikes, moments where the external pressure on the hull increased dramatically for a few seconds, then returned to expected levels. On June 3rd, during a dive that had been publicly reported as successful, the log showed a pressure spike at 2,000 metres depth. The annotation read, External percussion event dash source unidentified dash no damage observed. On June 9th, another spike, this time at 3,000 metres. Hull stress monitors registered readings that should have caused alarms, but apparently didn't. On June 14th, 4 days before the final dive, the most significant pre-disaster event occurred. At 3,500 metres, Titan experienced what the log described as lateral compression. Not pressure from above, which would be normal, not pressure equally distributed, which the hull was designed for. Pressure from the side, as if something had struck or pressed against the hull. The annotation on that entry was chilling. Microfracture, detected in aft hull segment dash, dive aborted dash returned to surface for inspection. Dash fracture could not be visually confirmed. Dash dive cleared for continuation. They knew something was wrong. They detected damage, but they couldn't see it, so they continued operations. Elias began reaching out to people who might be able to help him understand what he was seeing. He contacted metallurgists, pressure system experts, and acoustic engineers. He framed his questions carefully, presenting the data as hypothetical scenarios. What could cause sudden external pressure spikes at depth? What could create lateral compression on a submersible hull? The answers he got were troubling. Multiple experts told him the same thing. In the open ocean, at those depths, there's nothing that should create those kinds of pressure anomalies. The pressure at depth is immense, but it's also constant and predictable. It doesn't spike. It doesn't come from unexpected angles, unless something else is down there. A large object moving past the submersible? Possibly, if it were large enough and moving fast enough. But what moves at that speed at nearly 4,000 metres depth? A sudden current? Unlikely to create the patterns he was seeing. An underwater landslide or methane bubble release? The geology of the Titanic wreck site didn't support that explanation. That left options that no one wanted to say out loud. An undisclosed military vessel, an unknown geological phenomenon, or something else entirely. Part 4. The messages they didn't release public reporting established that Titan communicated with its surface support ship through text messages. This wasn't unusual for submersibles. Voice communication at those depths is difficult and often unreliable. Text messages sent through acoustic modems are more dependable. What the public was told was that Titan's last message was routine, a status update, everything normal. Then silence. But Elias's file contained something else, references to messages that never appeared in any official timeline. 6 messages that, according to the logs, were sent from Titan on June 18th. Between 0830 and 0852, coordinated universal time. The final message was logged as sent at 0853, just 1 minute before the pressure anomaly that appears to have preceded the implosion. The file didn't contain the full text of these messages. Instead, it had brief descriptions, possibly notes made by whoever was monitoring the communication. Elias spent days trying to track down anyone who might have access to the actual message logs. What he pieced together was fragmentary, but deeply unsettling. 0832. Message references visual distortion outside viewport. Description includes the phrase shimmering distortions and request for confirmation of expected visual phenomena at depth. 0837. Message mentions acoustic anomalies, described as metallic impacts not originating from hull stress or normal operational sounds. 0841. Request for sonar scan of surrounding area. Specific mention of possible object below current position. 0845. Query about whether another submersible is operating in the area. 0850. Request for immediate surface contact with Expedition Coordinator Nargiolet's previous dive data from the same location. 0853. Partial message, not fully transmitted. Begins with phrase, is there another, then nothing. At 0854, the extreme pressure anomaly. By 0856, Titan had ceased all communication and, according to Navy acoustic data, had imploded. What's extraordinary about these messages isn't just their content, it's that they were never mentioned in any official investigation summary, any press briefing, or any public statement. If they existed, they were deleted or suppressed. If they didn't exist, then why were they referenced in logs that otherwise proved to be completely accurate? Elias tried to approach this logically. Maybe the messages were routine and just not deemed relevant. Maybe they were communication tests. Maybe there was a mundane explanation. But he kept coming back to that June 18th entry at 0845. Query about whether another submersible is operating in the area. Why would Titan ask that question? What did they see or detect that made them think there was another vessel nearby? Part 5. The sounds. Nobody explained. The search for Titan captured global attention for days. Ships and aircraft searched the surface. Remotely operated vehicles searched the depths, and the whole time, acoustic monitoring equipment listened for any sign of the missing submersible. On June 20th, 2 days after Titan went missing, a Canadian P-3 Poseidon aircraft dropped sonobuoys into the search area. These devices float on the surface and extend hydrophones deep into the water to listen for sounds. Multiple sonobuoys detected what search coordinators described as banging noises at 30-minute intervals. This gave hope. Banging noises meant someone alive, trying to signal their location. The search intensified around the areas where the sounds were detected, but later analysis complicated the story. The banging sounds, it turned out, could have been anything. Underwater sounds travel in strange ways, reflecting and refracting, sometimes appearing to come from locations far from their actual source. Marine life, shifting metal on the ocean floor, even the search ships themselves could have created the sounds. The official position eventually became that the sounds were probably not related to Titan at all. Just acoustic artifacts of a noisy ocean environment. Elias's investigation revealed a different story. Through contacts he'd developed in the acoustic analysis community, Elias obtained copies of the actual sonobuoy recordings. Not the official summaries, not the press briefing descriptions, but the raw audio files and their technical analysis. What he found was extraordinary. The sounds detected on June 20th were not random. They occurred in patterns, every 30 minutes as reported. But the pattern was too regular, too mechanical. Human banging, even desperate human banging, would have variations in timing, in intensity, in rhythm. These sounds had none of that. They were metronomic, precise. More significant spectral analysis of the sounds showed frequency components that didn't match impacts on titanium or carbon fibre. The sounds had characteristics more consistent with sonar pings, specifically active sonar reflecting off a hard surface. In other words, something was down there using sonar, and whatever it wasn't Titan. Elias consulted with a retired naval acoustic technician named Marcus Webb, a man who'd spent 25 years listening to submarine sounds for the United States Navy. Webb lived in a small coastal town in Maine, and he agreed to meet Elias only after extensive vetting and assurances of anonymity. Webb analysed the recordings Elias had obtained. His conclusion was unequivocal. "This is active sonar," Webb told him. "Low frequency, high power, the kind of signature you get from a large object probably moving. And here's the thing that should concern you. I've heard a lot of sonar in my career. Russian submarines, Chinese submarines, our own boats, research vessels, you name it. This doesn't match anything in my reference library. The pulse structure is wrong. The frequency modulation is wrong. It's like someone built a sonar system that works on principles just slightly different from everyone else's." Elias asked the obvious question. Could it be classified military technology? Something we don't know about? Webb shrugged. Could be, but we're talking about the Titanic wreck site. That location isn't strategically important. There's no reason for any military to be operating experimental sonar systems there, unless they were looking for something specific. Like what? That's the question you should be asking. What's down there worth looking for? Part 6. The Navy's incomplete story. The United States Navy's acoustic monitoring system is called IUSS, the Integrated Underwater Surveillance System. It's a network of hydrophones scattered across the ocean floor, originally designed during the Cold War to track Soviet submarines. The system is so sensitive it can detect ships and submarines thousands of miles away. When the Navy announced on June 28th that they'd detected acoustic signatures consistent with Titan's implosion, it seemed like closure. They'd heard it happen. They could pinpoint when it occurred. The mystery of timing was solved. But Elias noticed something in the Navy's statement that bothered him. They said they detected signatures, plural, not signature, and they described them as anomalous, not standard, not typical, not matching known implosion patterns, anomalous. Through careful networking and more than one questionable information exchange, Elias obtained a document that would crack open the entire investigation. It was marked NAVCA, the Naval Sea Systems Command, with a classification header that had been partially redacted. The document was titled Atlantic Command Acoustic Analysis Event 0623 Echo. June 23rd was when debris from Titan was officially found. Echo was presumably just a designation code. But the contents of the document were extraordinary. The Navy had indeed detected Titan's implosion, but their analysis showed something nobody had made public. There were two distinct acoustic events, separated by 0.8 seconds. Less than a second, but clearly distinguishable in the high-fidelity recordings the IUSS system captured. The first event matched the expected signature of a pressure hull failure at depth. A sharp, powerful acoustic pulse. The sound of air-filled space suddenly collapsing under immense pressure. That was Titan imploding. But the second event, 0.8 seconds later, was different. The acoustic signature showed a different frequency profile, a different duration, and a different apparent point of origin. It was close to Titan, very close, but not the same location. The report's conclusion, partially redacted, suggested two possibilities. Either Titan imploded in stages, with different sections of the hull failing in rapid succession, or something else collapsed or impacted the ocean floor at nearly the same moment. The report recommended further analysis. That's where the document ended. Elias found no evidence that further analysis was ever conducted, or if it was buried deeper than he could dig. But the implications were staggering. If something else created an acoustic signature at the moment Titan imploded, what was it? And was it cause or coincidence? Part 7. The Warning They Ignored. As Elias dug deeper into OceanGate's history, he discovered that the problems with Titan went back much further than anyone publicly acknowledged. In 2019, 4 years before the disaster, Titan underwent a test dive that was aborted under concerning circumstances. The publicly available information about this dive was minimal. A test was conducted, some data was gathered, the dive ended early, end of story. But Elias found references to an internal report from that dive buried in technical forums where former OceanGate contractors sometimes posted anonymously. The 2019 test dive reached a depth of approximately 3,500 metres, just slightly shallower than the Titanic wreck site. During the dive, Titan's monitoring systems detected what the report called unexplained acoustic spikes. The hull stress sensors showed pressure distortions that didn't match modelled expectations, and most concerning, there was a notation about unknown external contact. Something touched the submersible, or got very close to it, at 3,500 metres depth in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. The dive was aborted immediately. Titan returned to the surface. Engineers examined every inch of the hull and found nothing wrong. No damage, no stress marks, no evidence of contact with anything. So they did what organisations often do when faced with an anomaly that can't be explained or repeated. They noted it in their records, decided it must have been a sensor glitch or a data interpretation error and moved on. But now Elias thought, what if it wasn't a glitch? What if in 2019 Titan encountered the same thing it would encounter fatally in 2023? And what if the difference was that in 2019 they turned back? He tried to find the engineers who worked on that 2019 analysis. 2 of them no longer worked in the maritime industry. One had moved to aerospace, another was working in renewable energy. When Elias contacted them through carefully worded LinkedIn messages, both declined to discuss their time at OceanGate, citing non-disclosure agreements. But one engineer, who requested absolute anonymity, sent Elias a brief message. "We found microscopic stress patterns in the hull after that dive that shouldn't have been there. Not from internal pressure, from external. Like something pressed against the hull with immense force, but only for a fraction of a second. Not long enough to cause failure, but long enough to leave a signature in the material structure. We were told to note it and move on. I think about that a lot now." Part 8. The Corridor. Everyone monitors. Marcus Webb, the retired Navy acoustic technician, told Elias something during their meeting that opened an entirely new line of investigation. "You need to understand something about that area of the Atlantic," Webb said. "The region around the Titanic wreck is one of the most acoustically monitored sections of ocean in the world." Elias was surprised. "Why? It's not near any major shipping lanes. It's not strategically important." Webb smiled grimly. "That's what makes it perfect. It's quiet. Background noise is minimal. Sound propagates clearly through the water column. During the Cold War, both we and the Soviets used that area as a reference point for calibrating acoustic systems. We knew the baseline acoustic signature of that region better than almost anywhere else in the ocean. So when something moves through there, when something creates sound, we notice. So the Navy would have known if there were any submarines in the area when Titan went down. Absolutely. They would have known about any vessel, any significant biological activity, any geological events. That corridor is transparent to acoustic monitoring. Nothing moves down there without someone hearing it." "Then why," Elias asked, "did the public receive so little information about what was detected?" Webb's expression darkened. "That's the question, isn't it? Either they detected nothing unusual, which seems unlikely given the anomalous signatures they admitted to, or they detected something they don't want to discuss." Elias spent the next several days researching the acoustic history of the Titanic wreck region. What he found was fascinating and disturbing. Since the 1980s, when the wreck was first discovered, there had been sporadic reports of unusual acoustic phenomena in the area. Nothing that made headlines, just footnotes in oceanographic research papers, metallic echoes that didn't correspond to the wreck itself, high-strength reflective signatures suggesting large metal objects in areas where no objects were charted, and occasional reports of objects moving faster than known submersibles or marine life could move at those depths. Every time these anomalies were detected, they were attributed to equipment malfunction, acoustic reflections from the wreck creating false images, or misidentification of known phenomena, standard scientific explanations for non-standard observations. But taken together, over decades, they painted a picture of a region where strange things happened with just enough regularity to be notable, but not enough to trigger serious investigation. Until now. Until Titan. Part 9. Nargeolet's Secret Map. Paul-Henri Nargeolet was 77 years old when he died aboard Titan. He'd spent decades exploring the Titanic wreck, earning the nickname Mr. Titanic. He knew that wreck site better than perhaps anyone alive. He'd documented it, studied it, and helped recover thousands of artifacts from the debris field. After the disaster, Nargeolet's contributions to Titanic research were widely celebrated. But Elias became interested in something else, what Nargeolet had been researching in the years before his death. Through contacts in the maritime archaeology community, Elias learned that Nargeolet had been working on a comprehensive sonar mapping project of the area surrounding the Titanic wreck. Not just the wreck itself, but the ocean floor for several kilometres in every direction. This wasn't public work, it was personal research, conducted during his many dives to the site. Nargeolet had apparently become fascinated by geological formations in the region, particularly to the east of the wreck. Elias managed to speak with a French oceanographer who had collaborated with Nargeolet on some projects. The oceanographer, who spoke on condition of anonymity, told Elias something remarkable. Paul found something unusual about 2 kilometres east of the Titanic, the oceanographer said. He showed me sonar images from one of his dives in 2021. There was a structure on the ocean floor that didn't match the surrounding geology. Very straight edges, almost geometric. Paul was fascinated by it. He called it Site Z. Just a designation he made up. He wanted to do a proper survey of it, but there was never time during the official Titanic dives. What did he think it was? Elias asked. He didn't speculate much. Paul was very careful about that, but he said the formation had anomalous geometry. That was his phrase. He thought it might be an unusual geological feature, possibly a rock formation shaped by ancient currents. But he also said the angles were too precise for natural formation. He wanted to investigate further. Elias felt a chill. Do you know if the Titan dive on June 18th was planning to visit Site Z? The oceanographer paused. I don't know for certain, but Paul mentioned to me in May that he was hoping to finally get a close look at the structure. He said this might be his last season diving at those depths, and he wanted to see it before he stopped. Elias tried to obtain Nageole's sonar maps. He contacted archives, research institutions, and personal associates. What he discovered was frustrating. Nageole's personal research materials had been collected by his family and were not available for review. Requests through official channels were politely declined. But Elias did find something, a presentation Nageole had given at a small maritime conference in 2022. The presentation was about advanced sonar techniques for wreck site mapping. Most of it was technical, but there was one slide near the end that caught Elias's attention. It showed a sonar image, high resolution, of the ocean floor. In the centre of the image was a formation that looked nothing like the surrounding sediment and rock. It was angular, with straight edges and what appeared to be right-angle corners. The slide had minimal text, just a location designation. 41 degrees, 43 minutes north, 49 degrees, 56 minutes west. Elias checked those coordinates, approximately 1,600 metres east of the Titanic wreck. Site Z. Part 10. The Deviation. Nobody mentioned. Titan's descent on June 18th should have been routine. Straight down to the Titanic wreck site, perhaps a slight adjustment for currents, but essentially a vertical descent to a precise location. Using publicly available data about the last known position of Titan's support ship and the known location of the Titanic wreck, Elias began reconstructing the submersible's dive path. He factored in typical current patterns for that region and time of year, the known drift rate of objects descending at the speed Titan would have been travelling, and the established protocols OceanGate used for approaching the wreck site. What he found was subtle but significant. Based on the timing of Titan's last communication and the location where debris was eventually found, the submersible appeared to have deviated from the standard approach path. Not dramatically, but noticeably. The deviation was to the east, towards Site Z. Elias couldn't prove that Titan intentionally headed toward the anomalous formation Nageole had been studying. The deviation could have been caused by currents, by a navigation adjustment, by any number of mundane factors. But the direction and magnitude of the deviation were consistent with a course change designed to bring Titan within visual range of coordinates, located 1,600 metres east of the Titanic. More significant, this deviation was not mentioned in any official briefing or investigation summary that Elias could find. The public narrative was that Titan was descending directly to the Titanic when it imploded, but the debris field location suggested otherwise. Why wasn't this mentioned? It could be simple oversight. In the chaos of the investigation and the tragedy of the loss, a minor course deviation might not have seemed important. But to Elias, it suggested something else. If Titan was approaching Site Z, and if that's where something went wrong, then acknowledging the deviation would raise questions about what they were doing there and what they might have found. Part 11. The structure beneath the wreck. Elias needed better data about what was actually on the ocean floor at Site Z. Sonar images from Nageole's presentation were provocative, but not conclusive. He needed to know if other researchers had detected the same anomaly. This led him to the archives of the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, one of the premier deep ocean research organisations in the world. Woods Hole had been involved in finding the Titanic wreck in 1985 and had conducted numerous surveys of the area in subsequent years. Elias submitted a Freedom of Information Act request for historical sonar data from the Titanic wreck region. Months passed with no response. He followed up repeatedly. Finally, he received a package containing digital files of sonar surveys conducted in the late 1990s. What he found in those surveys was extraordinary. A 1998 comprehensive mapping project had documented a large, unusual formation approximately 2 kilometres east-northeast of the Titanic wreck. The formation was described in technical notes as an unidentified seafloor feature, designated Feature 17B. The sonar images showed a structure with distinctly geometric characteristics. It appeared triangular in plan view, with edges that were remarkably straight given the chaotic nature of natural ocean floor formations. The formation was large, roughly 100 metres along its longest axis, and appeared to rise several metres above the surrounding sediment. Most intriguingly, the feature showed uniform acoustic reflectivity, suggesting it was composed of consistent material throughout, unlike the mixed sediment, rock, and debris typical of the ocean floor in that region. The survey report noted that Feature 17B represented an interesting geological phenomenon and recommended further investigation. As far as Elias could determine, no further investigation was ever conducted, or if it was, the results were not publicly available. Elias consulted with a geological oceanographer about the formation. He sent the sonar images without context, simply asking for an interpretation. The oceanographer's response was cautious, but intrigued. "This is unusual. The geometry is very regular, more regular than I'd expect from natural processes. It could be a rock formation that's been shaped by currents over millennia, but those edges are remarkably straight. It could be a type of sediment deposit with unusual consolidation properties, or it could be something else entirely. I'd need much higher resolution imaging and possibly core samples to say definitively. Where is this located?" When Elias told him, the oceanographer went silent for a moment, then said, "That's near the Titanic. Has anyone investigated this recently?" "Not that I can find." "That's surprising. You'd think with all the traffic to that wreck site, someone would have taken a closer look at anything unusual in the area. Unless," Elias thought, "someone had taken a closer look and didn't like what they found." Part 12, The Last Image. Elias's investigation had assembled a circumstantial case that something unusual existed at Site Zed, that Titan may have approached it, and that the submersible experienced external pressure events consistent with encountering something unexpected. But he had no direct evidence of what the Titan crew actually saw. Then he received a second anonymous message. This one came through an encrypted communication service, far more sophisticated than the original email. The message was brief. "Check the recovered control systems. File path recovered fragments / viewport camera / cache June 18. Titan's debris had been recovered and was under the custody of the National Transportation Safety Board. Some of that debris included electronic components from the submersible's control systems. Officially, no usable data had been recovered. The violence of the implosion and the subsequent time in saltwater had destroyed storage media and corrupted any data that might have survived." But Elias's anonymous source was suggesting otherwise. He spent weeks trying to figure out how to access or even verify the existence of recovered data files. He contacted people involved in the debris recovery, people involved in the investigation, and people who worked in data forensics. Nobody would acknowledge that recoverable data existed. Then, 3 months after the disaster, a small article appeared in a technical journal about advances in recovering data from damaged storage media, specifically mentioning work being done on the Titan investigation. The article was quickly retracted, with a note that it contained premature information, but Elias had saved a copy. The article mentioned that forensic specialists had successfully extracted partial files from a damaged solid-state drive recovered from Titan's control tablet. Most of the data was corrupted, but some image files had been partially reconstructed. Elias pulled every string he had, called in every favour, and eventually, through a chain of contacts that he would never fully reveal, obtained a file. A single image file, low resolution, partially corrupted, with large sections of missing data. But what remained was extraordinary. The image showed the view from Titan's viewport. The timestamp embedded in the file metadata read June 18th, 2023, 0853 Coordinated Universal Time, 2 minutes before the pressure anomaly, 1 minute before Titan's last partial message. The image was dark, as would be expected at that depth, with only Titan's external lights for illumination. But in the illuminated area there was something that didn't look like ocean floor, didn't look like the Titanic wreck, didn't look like anything Elias had ever seen in deep ocean photography. There was a surface, smooth, reflective, catching the light from Titan's floods. The reflectivity suggested metal, though it was impossible to be certain. And there was an edge, a sharp right angle where this surface met another surface perpendicular to it. The image was too corrupted to show more. Large sections of pixels were simply black, missing data. But in the remaining fragments, Elias could make out what appeared to be a corridor or opening, shadows suggesting depth beyond the visible surface, straight lines that spoke of artificial construction, not natural formation. It was only one image. It could have been an artifact of the corruption, pixels randomly aligning to create the illusion of structure. It could have been a reflection or an optical effect Elias wasn't understanding correctly. But it could also have been exactly what it appeared to be, a photograph of something artificial at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. Part 13. The Contact. Elias knew he was onto something significant. He'd been careful, using encryption, compartmentalizing his sources, not publishing anything publicly, but someone was paying attention. His phone rang one evening in late September, 3 months after the disaster. The number was blocked. He almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. Mr. North? A voice, male, professional, unaccented. Who is this? That's not important. What's important is that you stop investigating the structure. Elias felt his pulse quicken. What structure? You know what structure. The formation near the Titanic wreck. The deviation in Titan's descent path. The thing you've been building a case around. Stop. Why? Because it has nothing to do with the vessel failure. Titan failed because of structural inadequacies in its pressure hull. That's been established. Anything else you're pursuing is a distraction. Who are you? Elias asked again. Someone who's trying to help you avoid making a significant mistake. You're a respected analyst. You have a good reputation. Publishing conspiracy theories about secret structures on the ocean floor will destroy that reputation, and it won't accomplish anything. Are you saying there's no structure? A pause. I'm saying that what is or isn't on the ocean floor at that location is irrelevant to the Titan investigation. Then it shouldn't matter if I keep looking. Mr. North, please understand this carefully. There are things in the ocean that are best left undisturbed. The Titan tragedy was about engineering failure and poor decision-making. Making it about anything else serves no one. Walk away from this. And if I don't, the voice remained calm, then you'll find that your sources dry up, your reputation suffers, and your investigation leads nowhere. We're not threatening you, we're advising you, for your own benefit. The call ended. Elias sat in his apartment staring at his phone. The call had confirmed everything. There was something at Site Z. Titan had approached it, and someone with significant resources wanted the whole thing buried alongside the submersible. He immediately began backing up all his files to multiple secure locations. He documented the phone call. He prepared a summary of everything he'd found just in case. 3 days later, he woke up to find his computer's hard drive corrupted. All his local files were gone. His cloud storage accounts had been accessed and wiped. The backup drives he kept in a locked drawer had been remotely formatted. Everything was gone. Everything except the copies he'd hidden in places that weren't connected to any network. The files he'd stored on old USB drives and kept in a safe deposit box. The printed documents he'd mailed to himself and left unopened. Whoever had warned him had followed through. They demonstrated their capability, but they hadn't been quite thorough enough. Part 14. The Final Clue. Elias was scared, but also energized. The deletion of his files proved he was onto something real. You don't suppress information unless that information matters. He spent weeks being paranoid, checking for surveillance, varying his routines, communicating only through encrypted channels. He started rebuilding his research from the hidden backups, but he did it carefully, offline, with no digital footprint. Then, in mid-October, he received one more anonymous communication. This time it was a physical letter, delivered to a P.O. box he maintained under a different name. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a printed NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration header. The message was brief. The ocean floor holds things older than the wreck. They didn't want tourists finding out. Attached to the paper was a photograph, high resolution, professional quality, clearly taken by a remotely operated vehicle or submersible equipped with proper lighting. The image showed a section of ocean floor, sediment and rock, and embedded in that rock was a panel. Metal, clearly artificial, roughly 2 meters square. The panel showed signs of corrosion but was still intact. And on the panel's surface, just barely visible under the marine growth, was an edge, a right angle identical to what Elias had seen in the corrupted image from Titan. The photograph had no location data, no timestamp, no context, just the image and that single sentence message. Elias studied the photograph for hours. The metal was definitely artificial. The right angle was too precise to be natural, and the way it was embedded in the rock suggested it had been there for a very long time, not decades, possibly centuries. The surrounding geology showed no signs of recent disturbance. Whatever this was, it had been on the ocean floor near the Titanic wreck for a long time, long enough for rock to partially cover it, long enough for marine growth to obscure its features, but not long enough to be eroded away or consumed by corrosion. Elias considered what he knew. There was an anomalous formation at Site Z. That formation had geometric features inconsistent with natural geology. Nargileh had known about it and wanted to investigate it. Titan had deviated toward it during its final dive. The submersible had experienced external pressure anomalies. The crew had sent messages suggesting they saw something unexpected, and then Titan had imploded, possibly coincidentally, possibly not. And now someone had sent him proof that there was indeed something artificial at that location. Something old. Something someone very much wanted to keep secret. Part 15. The upload. Elias knew he had to release what he'd found. Keeping it to himself served no purpose, and if something happened to him, the information would be lost. But releasing it through traditional channels would get it suppressed immediately. Academic journals would reject it. Maritime organisations would discredit it. The story would be killed before it ever reached the public. So he did what whistleblowers in the digital age do. He prepared a comprehensive report, including all his evidence, all his sources, all his analysis. He encrypted it and uploaded it to multiple secure platforms. He sent links to journalists, researchers and activists he trusted. He posted it on forums dedicated to deep-sea mysteries and maritime anomalies. The last line of his report read, "The Titan didn't fail because of bad engineering alone. It failed because it got too close to something it wasn't supposed to find. Something that's been hidden at the bottom of the Atlantic for longer than anyone wants to admit. Something that raises questions our institutions aren't prepared to answer." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, the report was being shared across the internet. News outlets picked up the story. Other researchers came forward with their own anomalous findings from the Titanic wreck region. The conspiracy gained momentum, and then, 24 hours after Elias posted his report, every link went dead. Every copy of the file showed as corrupted or deleted. The forums where he'd posted were suddenly offline for maintenance. Journalists who'd contacted him stopped responding. The story disappeared almost as quickly as it had appeared, scrubbed from the internet by forces with resources Elias couldn't match. He tried to repost. He created new accounts, used different platforms, sent out new copies of the file. But each time, within hours, everything was deleted. Someone was monitoring the entire internet for any mention of his research and removing it faster than he could spread it. 1 week after his initial upload, Elias received a final message. It came through an encrypted channel he'd thought was secure. Just 3 words. "Stop now, please." Elias made one last attempt. He contacted a documentary filmmaker he knew, someone with a reputation for investigating controversial topics. They agreed to meet in person, no electronic communication, no paper trail. The meeting never happened. Elias didn't show up. Calls to his phone went to voicemail. His apartment was found empty, with no signs of struggle, no indication of where he'd gone. Elias North hasn't been heard from since November 2023. His family filed a missing person report. Police investigated and found no evidence of foul play. His bank accounts haven't been accessed. His phone hasn't been used. He simply vanished. Some say he went into hiding. Some say he was silenced. Some say he never existed at all. That the whole investigation was an elaborate internet hoax. But copies of his report still circulate in the darkest corners of the internet, on encrypted networks, in private forums where people trade information too dangerous to share openly. And people who've read it, people who understand what it implies, look at maps of the Atlantic Ocean a little differently now. Because somewhere 2.5 miles beneath the surface near the wreck of the Titanic, there is something that shouldn't be there. Something old. Something hidden. Something that 5 people got too close to on June 18th, 2023. And the official story, the one about engineering failure and poor decision-making, is true as far as it goes. It just doesn't go far enough. Epilogue. Questions without answers. The OceanGate Titan disaster killed 5 people and ended a company. Investigations determined that the submersible's carbon fibre hull was inadequate for repeated deep dives, that safety protocols were insufficient, that warnings were ignored. All of that is true and documented. But the questions Elias North raised remain unanswered. Why were pressure anomalies detected weeks before the final dive? Why were text messages referencing visual and acoustic anomalies never released? Why did acoustic monitoring detect 2 distinct events during the implosion? What is the geometric formation at Site Z? Why did Titan appear to deviate toward that location? What did the partially recovered image actually show? These questions make people uncomfortable, because they suggest the disaster wasn't just about corporate recklessness and engineering failure. They suggest there was something else involved, something that doesn't fit the narrative we've been told, and maybe that's the point. Maybe some truths are too complicated, too disruptive, too unsettling to acknowledge. Maybe it's easier to accept a story about human error than to confront the possibility that there are things in our ocean we don't understand, things we've been carefully avoiding for reasons we're not privy to. The ocean covers 70% of our planet. We've explored perhaps 5% of it in any meaningful detail. We know more about the surface of Mars than we do about the deepest parts of our own ocean. And in those unexplored depths, in the crushing pressure and absolute darkness, there might be things that have been there longer than human civilization. Things that weren't meant to be found. Things that powerful institutions have known about and decided to keep secret. The Titan is gone. The 5 people aboard are gone. Elias North is gone. But the questions remain, floating in the dark water, waiting for the next person brave or foolish enough to ask them. And somewhere, 2.5 miles down, Site Z is still there, still geometric, still anomalous, still waiting. That's the story of the pressure. Files, the investigation that disappeared, and the questions nobody wants answered. Make of it what you will. Draw your own conclusions, but the next time you hear about deep-sea exploration, about submersibles diving to historic wrecks, about the mysteries of the ocean floor, remember that there are some places where, maybe, just maybe, we're not supposed to go. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this documentary, please use your hype points on the video. It genuinely helps us more than you can imagine. And let us know in the comments what time it is where you are and where you're listening from. We love connecting with all of you around the world. Until next time, this is Sleep Theories, where the truth is always deeper than it seems.